It began with men who fell from the sky believing speed could replace certainty. The first parachute army was not created for prolonged war. It was built for shock, surprise, and moments measured in minutes rather than months. Its soldiers trained to drop behind enemy lines, to seize bridges, crossroads, and cities, before defenders fully understood what was happening. They were taught to move light, fight hard, and hold on just long enough for relief to arrive. In theory, it was modern war at its most daring. In reality, it would become something far heavier. By the time the first parachute army took shape as a field army, the war had already changed. Air superiority had shifted, resources had thinned. The luxury of surprise had all but disappeared. What remained was an elite force asked to do something it was never designed for: fight as conventional infantry, often without the mobility, supply, or support that had once defined its purpose. The early reputation of German paratroopers was formidable. In places like Crete and earlier campaigns, they had shown discipline, aggression, and resilience under fire. But those victories came at enormous cost, and they taught the enemy valuable lessons. By the time the first parachute army entered large-scale operations in the West, the skies were no longer forgiving. Dropping behind enemy lines was no longer an option. Holding ground became the priority. Endurance replaced surprise. The army found itself defending cities, river lines, and forests, terrain where elite training mattered, but numbers, artillery, and supply mattered more. In Normandy, elements of the first parachute army fought in bitter defensive battles as Allied forces expanded their foothold. These were not dramatic airborne assaults. They were grim fights in hedgerows, towns, and rubble-strewn fields where every advance was contested and every withdrawal threatened collapse. The paratroopers fought hard, often stubbornly, earning respect from enemies who knew they were facing disciplined troops. But discipline could not replace fuel. It could not replace air cover. It could not replace manpower lost faster than it could be replaced. As the Allies pushed east, the first parachute army was pulled into a series of defensive roles that stretched it thin. River lines like the Scheldt and later the Rhine became anchors, temporary barriers meant to slow an advance that no longer needed to rush. Paratroopers dug in, held ground, withdrew, and held again, fighting a delaying war that offered no illusions of victory. Then came the Netherlands. During Operation Market Garden, the first parachute army faced one of the war's most ambitious Allied airborne operations. This time, the roles were reversed. Paratroopers who had once fallen from the sky now waited on the ground, defending bridges, towns, and approaches against airborne troops descending into chaos. The fighting was fierce, confused, and costly on both sides. Urban combat replaced open maneuver. Rivers became traps. Roads turned into corridors of destruction. The first parachute army held where it could, not because it would change the war, but because holding was the only remaining task. As the conflict dragged into winter, the army absorbed the pressure of Allied advances and the shock waves of the Ardennes fighting nearby. Units were shifted constantly, often arriving just in time to plug gaps or delay breakthroughs. Equipment shortages worsened. Replacements arrived with less training and fewer illusions. What remained was cohesion forged through hardship rather than hope. By the final months of the war, the first parachute army was no longer an army of dissent. It was an army of resistance. Paratroopers fought as infantry in ruins, forests, and river valleys. They defended cities already shattered. They withdrew across ground that offered no defensive depth. They continued to function because discipline had become habit, not because success was possible. When surrender finally came, it did not come with spectacle. It came with exhaustion. With empty ammunition pouches, with men who had fought far beyond the role they were trained for. The history of the first parachute army is not a story of airborne glory alone. It is a story of transformation, of elite troops repurposed by necessity, of courage that endured even as purpose faded. It shows how specialization can be erased by circumstance, and how identity in war is often reshaped by what remains possible rather than what was intended. Tonight, we return to that complicated history, to the men who once fell from the sky and later held ground with nowhere left to fall, to the cities, rivers, and forests where elite training met strategic collapse, to the first parachute army, and the war that forced it to fight in ways it was never meant to. Before we continue, let me pause and include you in this moment as well. Where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time has found you there? Is it late into the night, early morning, or that quiet space between where the world feels briefly still? If these long, steady journeys through overlooked commands help you slow down, reflect, or unwind while learning how wars truly evolve, consider subscribing, not for excitement, but so these thoughtful, unhurried histories are always here when you want to listen without rushing forward. August 1936. Kiev, Soviet Ukraine. The afternoon sun beats down on a military airfield where foreign observers sit in wooden bleachers, field glasses raised toward an empty sky. Among them, a German Luftwaffe attaché named Friedrich Christiansen shifts uncomfortably in his seat, sweat darkening his collar. He has flown 2,000 kilometers to witness what Soviet propaganda claims will revolutionize warfare. Around him, French, British, Japanese, and Italian officers murmur skepticism. Then the drone begins, distant at first, then building to a roar that silences every conversation. The sky darkens not with clouds, but with aircraft, and suddenly, impossibly, the air fills with white blossoms. 1,500 Soviet paratroopers descend simultaneously, their parachutes creating a canopy that blocks the sun. Christensen's hands tremble as he scribbles notes. He watches the paratroopers land in waves, organizing with practiced efficiency, setting up anti-tank guns and mortars within minutes of touchdown. What he witnesses is not a circus stunt, but a fully operational military capability, vertical envelopment on a scale no Western power has remotely approached. The Soviet Union, dismissed by many as technologically backward, has fielded over 10,000 trained paratroopers. They possess specialized equipment, dedicated transport aircraft, and most terrifying of all, a coherent doctrine for their use. The demonstration continues for 3 hours. When it ends, Christensen knows he must deliver a message to Berlin that will cause panic in the highest reaches of German military command. The Soviets have weaponized the sky, and Germany has nothing to match it. The alarm reaches Hermann Göring's ornate office in Berlin 3 weeks later. The Luftwaffe chief, resplendent in his custom-designed uniform, heavy with medals, reads Christensen's report with growing fury. How could Germany, with its vaunted technological superiority and military tradition, fall so far behind in such a critical domain? The answer is both simple and humiliating. While the Soviets experimented with airborne forces throughout the 1920s, Germany remained shackled by Versailles Treaty restrictions and institutional blindness. The German military establishment viewed parachute troops as novelties, suitable perhaps for sabotage missions, but irrelevant to modern mechanized warfare. Now that assumption looked catastrophically short-sighted. Göring summons his staff and delivers an ultimatum. Germany will develop airborne capability, and it will do so immediately. The race to control the vertical dimension has begun, and Germany is years behind. The man chosen to build Germany's airborne forces from nothing is 50-year-old Kurt Student, a decorated First World War pilot with an engineering background and a reputation for both innovation and recklessness. In January 1937, Student arrives at Stendal, a windswept military base in Brandenburg, where he confronts the immensity of his task. He has no training facilities, no parachutes suitable for military use, no doctrine, and no cadre of experienced instructors. What he does have is Göring's support and a sense of desperate urgency. Student begins by studying everything available about Soviet and Italian airborne programs, gleaning what insights he can from grainy newsreel footage and fragmentary intelligence reports. He makes immediate decisions that will shape German airborne forces for their entire existence. German paratroopers will jump from low altitude, 400 feet instead of the Soviet standard of 800, to minimize time exposed to enemy fire. They will exit aircraft in rapid succession to concentrate forces on the ground. But doctrine alone cannot create an airborne force. Student needs equipment, and here Germany's late start becomes painfully apparent. The RZ-16 parachute, Germany's first attempt at military-grade equipment, is adapted from Italian designs and plagued with problems. The canopy opens too slowly, causing hard landings and injuries. The harness design makes it impossible for jumpers to steer or control their descent. Student watches his first volunteers, hand-picked Luftwaffe personnel who believe they are joining an elite unit, suffer through training jumps that are as dangerous as combat. Broken ankles and concussions become routine. The casualty rate during training reaches 15%, unacceptable by any military standard. Student demands modifications, engaging in bitter bureaucratic warfare with Luftwaffe procurement offices that view parachute troops as an expensive distraction. Progress comes in agonizing increments. Spring 1938 brings both triumph and catastrophe. The RZ-20 parachute, incorporating students' demanded improvements, enters production. Training standards stabilize, and the first 200 qualified Fallschirmjäger, literally parachute hunters, complete their certification. Göring, sensing a propaganda opportunity, orders a demonstration jump for Adolf Hitler himself. The event takes place at Döberitz, near Berlin, on a crisp April morning. Student, determined to prove his force's capability, insists on participating in the demonstration jump personally. It is a decision born of ego and conviction. How can he command men in an operation he has not proven himself willing to undertake? The Führer arrives in his motorcade, surrounded by Wehrmacht generals skeptical of this expensive Luftwaffe experiment. Student boards the Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft with his men, their faces tight with determination. What happens next will haunt student for the rest of his life. The jump proceeds smoothly until student's parachute deploys. A gust of wind catches his canopy just as he nears the ground, slamming him sideways into the hard-packed earth. The impact fractures his skull in 3 places. Student loses consciousness instantly, crumpling in front of the assembled Nazi leadership. The demonstration dissolves into chaos as medics rush forward. Hitler watches impassively, then turns to his entourage with a dismissive comment that one witness later recalls as, "These aviation toys cost too much and accomplish too little." Student is rushed to hospital in critical condition. Doctors give him a 30% chance of survival. For 9 months, he lies in hospital beds, undergoing 3 surgeries, fighting through blinding headaches and partial paralysis. The man who emerges from this ordeal is changed, more cautious, more methodical, obsessed with minimizing risk to his paratroopers. Student's absence creates a leadership vacuum precisely when German airborne forces need decisive direction. The Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht engage in vicious bureaucratic combat over who will control parachute units. The Luftwaffe argues that airborne forces depend entirely on air transport, and therefore must remain under aviation command. The Wehrmacht counters that paratroopers are infantry who happen to arrive by air. Ground forces matter. The dispute reaches Hitler's desk, and in a decision that will have profound consequences, he rules in favor of the Luftwaffe. This means German paratroopers will exist in organizational limbo, soldiers administered by airmen, ground combatants commanded by pilots, elite infantry whose doctrine and equipment procurement will be influenced by people who have never led men in ground combat. The inefficiencies this creates will compound throughout the war. When student returns to duty in January 1939, he finds that Germany's airborne capability has barely advanced during his convalescence. The Soviet Union continues expanding its paratrooper forces, now numbering over 30,000. Italy has fielded 2 parachute divisions. Germany possesses 1 understrength regiment of roughly 1,200 qualified jumpers. The equipment situation remains dire. Germany's total inventory of RZ-20 parachutes numbers under 2,000, barely sufficient for a single combat drop. Transport aircraft are in even shorter supply. The Luftwaffe owns 475 Ju-52 aircraft, but these are needed for cargo transport and casualty evacuation across Germany's vast borders. Allocating enough aircraft for a regimental-sized airborne operation would cripple logistical operations elsewhere. Student drafts memo after memo warning that Germany's airborne forces are unprepared for war. But his warnings dissolve into the bureaucratic machine. Then, history overtakes preparation. September 1939, Germany invades Poland, and Europe plunges into war. Students Fallschirmjäger play only marginal roles in the Poland campaign, executing small-scale jumps to seize bridges and disrupt communications. These operations succeed not because of superior training or equipment, but because Polish forces are already collapsing under the Wehrmacht's mechanized onslaught. The paratroopers' contributions barely register in official reports. Yet, within the Luftwaffe High Command, a dangerous narrative takes root. Airborne operations work, and they can achieve objectives impossible for conventional forces. Göring, seeking glory for his Luftwaffe, separate from Wehrmacht ground victories, becomes an enthusiastic champion of expanding parachute forces. Student receives authorization to expand from one regiment to a full division, 7,200 men. The expansion timeline is impossibly compressed, 6 months to triple the force. Student accepts the challenge, knowing he is building something fragile, something that looks formidable on organizational charts, but conceals critical weaknesses. The 1st Parachute Division of the Luftwaffe exists, but it is not ready for the mission that awaits it, not even close. May 10th, 1940, 4:30 in the morning. Belgian airspace. 27-year-old Lieutenant Rudolf Witzig crouches in the cramped fuselage of a DFS 230 glider as his tow plane struggles through darkness above the German-Belgian border. Behind him, 10 men press against wooden benches, their faces ghostly in the faint instrument glow. The glider contains half a ton of specially designed explosive charges, each shaped to penetrate the most heavily fortified structure in Europe. Below them, Fort Eben-Emael guards the Albert Canal crossing, a fortress so powerful that Belgian military planners believe it makes their country's eastern border impregnable. 1,700 meters of concrete tunnels house 1,200 defenders and 60 artillery pieces. Military theorists calculate that capturing Eben-Emael would require a division-strength assault lasting 4 to 5 days. Witzig and his 78 paratroopers have been given 24 hours. Then the tow rope snaps. The sudden release jerks Witzig forward against his restraints. The glider pilot fights for control as the aircraft drops away from its tow plane, losing altitude rapidly in the darkness. They are still over Germany, kilometers short of their target. The pilot makes the only decision possible: find a field and land before they crash. The glider impacts in a farmer's field outside Cologne, skidding to a stop in soft earth. Witzig scrambles out, fury and desperation warring in his chest. His radio is useless at this range. His men are continuing toward the target without their commander. The entire operation, months of planning, specialized training, unprecedented tactical innovation, is underway, and he is sitting in a German wheat field. Witzig commandeers a vehicle, races to the nearest Luftwaffe base, and essentially hijacks a training aircraft, ordering the terrified pilot to fly him to Belgium. Behind him, his leaderless assault detachment approaches the most heavily defended fortress in Western Europe, 5:15 in the morning. 9 DFS gliders detach from their tow aircraft over the Albert Canal, descending in eerie silence toward their objectives. The surprise is total. Belgian defenders at Fort Eben-Emael hear the whisper of wind over canvas but see nothing in the pre-dawn darkness. The gliders land directly on the fortress roof with such precision that one skids to a stop just 3 meters from a ventilation shaft. The first Belgian soldier to emerge from a stairwell is shot before he can raise the alarm. The assault teams move with extraordinary speed, placing their specially designed hollow charge explosives against armored cupolas housing artillery pieces. The shaped charges, a cutting-edge technology that Belgium's engineers never anticipated, focus explosive force into a narrow jet capable of penetrating 2.5 meters of reinforced concrete. The first detonation tears through an armored turret like paper, killing its crew instantly and sending a shockwave through the fortress that alerts every defender. What follows is a masterpiece of small unit tactics executed by men who suddenly realize they are succeeding. Sergeant Helmut Wenzel leads 6 men in systematically destroying artillery positions before Belgian forces can organize a coherent response. Private Klaus Müller crawls into a destroyed cupola and drops grenades down the access shaft, clearing the tunnel section below. The Fallschirmjäger use smoke grenades to blind observation ports, explosive charges to seal fortress entrances, and machine gun fire to suppress Belgian defenders attempting to reach their battle positions. The chaos inside Eben Emael becomes complete. Defenders in underground tunnels cannot see what is happening on the surface. Surface guards cannot communicate with command posts below, and the fort's supposedly impregnable armored shell is being penetrated in a dozen places simultaneously. Belgian artillery fire toward France and Luxembourg, missions prepared for weeks, falls silent as gun after gun is destroyed or abandoned. Simultaneously, 3 additional assault groups strike bridges over the Albert Canal at Vroonhoven, Veld-Weselt, and Caen. Here the tactical elegance of Eben Emael disintegrates into brutal violence. Belgian engineers have prepared the bridges for demolition, and when German gliders land, defenders immediately attempt to trigger the charges. At Vroonhoven Bridge, Fallschirmjäger, under Lieutenant Martin Schechter, assault across open ground directly into machine gun fire. Belgian defenders, fighting from prepared positions, cut down the first wave. Schechter watches half his assault team fall in the first 60 seconds. German doctrine calls for rapid, overwhelming aggression, and Schechter follows it, ordering his survivors to charge the bridge defenses while suppressing fire-pins Belgian defenders. The battle becomes savage. Grenades exchanged at ranges of 5 meters, bayonet charges into machine gun nests, individual acts of suicidal bravery on both sides. The bridge at Vroonhoven is captured intact, but 53 German paratroopers lie dead or wounded around it. The pattern repeats at the other bridges with varying degrees of success. Veld-Weselt Bridge falls quickly when Belgian demolition charges fail to detonate, either sabotaged by German agents or simply defective. Caen Bridge explodes in the face of advancing Fallschirmjäger, forcing them to secure a damaged span under continuous fire. The tactical picture becomes clear. Where German paratroopers achieve surprise and face disorganized resistance, they succeed brilliantly. Where defenders have time to respond and explosives are properly prepared, German casualties mount catastrophically. Of the 500 Fallschirmjäger committed to the bridge assaults, 180 are killed or wounded in the first hour. These are not acceptable losses. They are devastating casualties that would cripple conventional infantry and threaten the entire operation's viability. But German doctrine demands holding objectives at any cost, and reinforcements are racing forward. Rudolf Witzig finally arrives at Eben Emael at 11:30 in the morning, 6 hours after the assault began. He lands his commandeered aircraft on a road near the fortress and sprints toward his objective, expecting to find disaster. Instead, he discovers his sergeant has methodically executed every phase of the assault plan in his absence. 21 of the fort's main artillery cupolas are destroyed or disabled. Belgian defenders, stunned and demoralized, are trapped in their underground tunnels, unable to escape and unwilling to launch counterattacks against an enemy whose size and positions they cannot determine. Witzig takes command and begins the process of systematically reducing the fortress, using demolition charges to collapse tunnel entrances and smoke grenades to force defenders deeper underground. The Belgian commander, Major Jean Jotrand, realizes his situation is hopeless, but Belgian military honor and orders from Brussels demand continued resistance. The siege settles into a grim stalemate. For 30 hours, Eben Emael resists. Belgian defenders mount several counterattacks from underground tunnels, achieving temporary successes before being driven back by German machine gun fire and grenades. Artillery fire from Belgian positions south of the fortress pounds the German-held surface installations, killing 7 more Fallschirmjäger and wounding 14 others. But the outcome is inevitable. German reinforcements reach the fortress on May 11th, bringing heavy weapons and fresh troops. At noon, on May 11th, Major Jotrand surrenders. 1,200 Belgian defenders march into captivity, leaving behind a fortress whose legend of impregnability has been shattered in little more than a day. The German casualties tell their own story. 23 dead, 64 wounded from the Eben Emael assault itself, acceptable by military standards. But adding the bridge assaults brings total casualties to 180 killed or wounded, over 20% of the committed force. Student arrives at the captured fortress on May 12th for an inspection tour that is part tactical assessment and part propaganda exercise. Newsreel cameras follow him through the shattered cupolas and smoke-stained tunnels, recording footage that will be shown in every German cinema within a week. Student examines the hollow charge penetrations, noting how the shaped explosives performed beyond predictions. He questions the surviving assault team members, learning that the single greatest factor in their success was complete surprise. Belgian defenders simply had no doctrine or training for responding to enemies landing directly on their fortress roof. Student's engineer mind calculates what this operation reveals. Glider assault can deliver troops with extraordinary precision and complete surprise. Specialized weapons can overcome seemingly impregnable fortifications. Small, highly trained teams can achieve objectives impossible for conventional forces. But he also notes the sobering casualty reports from the bridges. What happens when defenders have warning, when surprise evaporates, when light infantry meets prepared positions? The world notices. Within days, military attachés from every major power are filing reports analyzing the Eben Emael operation. British military intelligence concludes that German parachute forces represent a serious threat to defensive installations, previously considered invulnerable. French High Command orders emergency modifications to Maginot Line fortifications, installing anti-aircraft batteries and obstacles to prevent glider landings. Soviet observers, whose parachute forces dwarf Germany's, note German tactical innovations, while dismissing the operation as small-scale and unrepeatable. And in Berlin, Adolf Hitler personally decorates Rudolf Witzig and his surviving men, declaring the Fallschirmjäger to be elite of the elite, Germany's answer to any military challenge. But missing from the celebration is sober analysis of what the operation actually proved. Airborne assault works magnificently against surprised, unprepared defenders with limited reserves. What happens when the enemy expects paratroopers, when they position machine guns to cover landing zones, when they maintain mobile reserves to counterattack? Student has seen the casualty reports from the bridges. He knows the answer, and it terrifies him. June 1940. Berlin, Reich Chancellery. Crete. Student stands at attention before Adolf Hitler, sweat dampening his collar despite the room's coolness. The Führer is in expansive mood, riding the wave of France's collapse and Britain's ejection from continental Europe. Hitler circles Student like a predator, examining prey, then abruptly pins the Knight's Cross on Student's tunic himself, a rare honor. The speech that follows becomes legend in Fallschirmjäger lore. Germany's parachute forces, Hitler declares, are the nation's military vanguard, combining Prussian discipline with technological modernity. They represent the future of warfare, mobile, elite, decisive. Student should expand his forces aggressively. 3 divisions minimum, 5 if possible. The Luftwaffe will provide all necessary resources. Student exits the meeting with the Knight's Cross on his chest and dread in his heart. He knows what Hitler does not, that Germany's airborne capability is a facade, impressive in newsreels, but fragile in reality. Now he must triple that fragile force in months, not years. The expansion order reaches Fallschirmjäger training centers in early July, causing immediate chaos. Stendal and Wittstock facilities, designed for processing 200 recruits every 16 weeks, suddenly face demands to graduate 3,000 men in the same period. Major Hans Kroh, senior training commandant, reads the directive and immediately understands it cannot be executed without catastrophic compromise. The mathematics are brutal. Training one parachute-qualified soldier requires 8 jumps minimum, each requiring specialized aircraft, parachutes, and instructor supervision. Expanding to division strength demands over 40,000 individual training jumps. Germany's entire training fleet consists of 90 Ju-52 aircraft, already strained beyond sustainable limits. Kroh drafts a memo explaining the impossibility, then tears it up. Göring has spoken, the Führer has commanded. Explaining reality to those living in fantasy is career suicide. The shortcuts begin immediately and compound relentlessly. Instructor-to-student ratios, previously maintained at 1:8 to ensure safety and competence, balloon to 1:25. Veteran Fallschirmjäger, who should be forming cadres for new combat units instead, find themselves endlessly recycling through training centers, jumping with terrified recruits who have received half the preparation. Jump training, that previously spanned 8 weeks, compresses to 4, then 3. Required jumps decrease from 8 to 5. Physical conditioning that emphasized strength and endurance shifts toward basic fitness. Can the recruit run 5 kilometers and do 20 push-ups? Good enough. Selection standards evaporate. Chronic health issues previously disqualifying now merit waivers. The average Fallschirmjäger recruit of summer 1940 is 19 years old, minimally trained, and has completed exactly 5 parachute jumps before being declared combat ready. August brings the first training deaths attributable directly to the rushed expansion. Private Werner Koch, a 20-year-old farmer's son from Saxony, exits a WW2 on his 4th training jump and immediately experiences partial parachute malfunction. The canopy deploys but fails to fully inflate, creating a phenomenon instructors call candlesticking. The parachute descends in a long, narrow column that provides almost no deceleration. Koch impacts the ground at 40 kilometers per hour, dying instantly from massive internal injuries. The accident report is marked confidential and filed without distribution. 3 weeks later, Private Hans Dietrich dies when his static line tangles during exit, leaving him suspended from the aircraft fuselage, choking to death before instructors can cut him free. September claims 6 more recruits to training accidents, parachutes deploying late, mid-air collisions, hard landings on obstacles. By October, the training death rate has increased 300% compared to 1939. Commanders order investigations that produce recommendations. Slow the expansion, return to proven standards, prioritize safety over speed. The recommendations are ignored. Equipment shortages become critical by autumn 1940. RZ-20 parachute production from Germany's sole manufacturing facility in Braunschweig reaches 800 units monthly. Training and operational requirements now demand 2,000. The shortfall means parachutes must be reused immediately after training jumps, with minimal inspection and no time for thorough repacking. Quality control, never robust, essentially ceases. Quartermaster records show that by November, over 30% of training parachutes have been used more than 50 times, far beyond manufacturer recommendations. The WW52 transport fleet fares even worse. Designed for cargo transport, these aircraft are being flown at sortie rates triple their peacetime maintenance schedules. Engine failures become routine. Landing gear malfunctions ground aircraft for weeks, awaiting spare parts that never arrive. Of 90 aircraft allocated to training centers in July, only 43 remain operational by December. The human cost manifests in unexpected ways. Veteran Fallschirmjäger from Eben Emael and the Polish campaign watch raw recruits stumble through training exercises they would have executed flawlessly just months earlier. Sergeant Wilhelm Prager, who led an assault team across Veldwozelt Bridge, now commands a training company at Stendal. His diary entries from October 1940 reveal mounting despair. Today we processed 46 recruits through their qualification jumps. 8 froze in the door and refused to exit. 12 landed outside the designated zone. 2 broke bones. I certified them all as qualified. What else can I do? The institutional knowledge of what made Fallschirmjäger elite, intensive training, careful selection, veteran mentorship, is being diluted beyond recognition. The men graduating in late 1940 wear the same uniforms and insignia as their predecessors, but they are not the same soldiers. The paper reorganization proceeds regardless of reality. 7th Flieger Division, the original parachute division that executed Eben Emael, officially splits into 3 divisions, 7th, 2nd, and 3rd, in November 1940. On organizational charts, this creates an airborne corps of over 40,000 men. The reality is starkly different. 1st Division fields 8,000 troops, barely above half its authorized strength. 2nd Division exists primarily on paper, with 4,000 assigned personnel scattered across training centers. 3rd Division comprises cadres and administrative staff totaling fewer than 500 soldiers. Equipment allocations bear no relationship to operational reality. Divisions officially authorized 40 transport aircraft receive 12. Heavy weapons companies requiring 24 mortars receive 6. Communications equipment, already scarce, gets distributed in penny packets, ensuring no unit has sufficient radios for effective command and control. Student observes this catastrophe from Fliegerkorps headquarters in Berlin, promoted to commanding general of all German airborne forces. His position provides panoramic view of the disaster while offering no authority to stop it. He drafts planning documents for future operations, knowing the forces described on paper cannot execute the missions assigned. His staff briefs invasion plans for Britain, Operation Sea Lion, showing 3 parachute divisions conducting coordinated drops to seize Dover, Brighton, and Hastings. Student knows Germany barely has aircraft to lift 1 division, and that division would be composed largely of recruits who have never participated in a combat jump. The planning continues because stopping means admitting the expansion is failing, and admitting failure in the Third Reich carries consequences worse than perpetuating fantasy. The golden summer of expansion has created an airborne force impressive in propaganda films and frightening on organizational charts, but fragile as glass. December 1940. Stendal Training Center. A recruit class completes its final qualifying jump in snow and freezing wind. They are declared combat-ready Fallschirmjäger, issued their distinctive smocks and helmets, and assigned to 2nd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, currently forming for deployment to Bulgaria. Their average age is 19. Their average training time is 9 weeks. They have completed 5 parachute jumps in their military careers. They believe themselves elite warriors because their officers tell them so, and their uniforms distinguish them from regular Wehrmacht infantry. In 5 months, most of them will be dead on Crete. But in this moment, as they board trains heading south, they embody both the triumph and tragedy of Germany's airborne expansion. Soldiers transformed into symbols, quantity mistaken for quality, ambition unmoored from capability. The paper army is ready to fight. The real army is not. May 20th, 1941, 7:05 in the morning. Mediterranean airspace above Crete. Major Walter Koch, commanding 1st Assault Regiment, crouches in the open doorway of his Ju-52 transport as the Greek island materializes through morning haze below. Behind him, 16 men compress against the fuselage walls, their faces tight with anticipation and fear. This is the largest airborne operation in military history. 10,000 paratroopers dropping on 4 objectives simultaneously. And Koch knows that everything they learned at Eben-Emael is about to be tested at 20 times the scale. The transport formations stretch for kilometers, 493 aircraft carrying the fate of Germany's airborne ambitions. Then the first aircraft enters range of Crete's defenses, and the sky erupts. Tracer fire arcs upward in streams of red and green. Anti-aircraft shells burst in black clouds. A Jew, 50 meters ahead, takes a direct hit, exploding into a fireball that momentarily silhouettes every aircraft around it. The parachute invasion of Crete has begun. Koch's aircraft banks violently, the pilot attempting evasive action while maintaining course toward Malmö airfield, the operation's critical objective. Through the door, Koch sees the airfield below, and his blood turns cold. British and New Zealand defenders are not cowering in bunkers. They are positioned in the open, in trenches and weapon pits, firing into the descending transports with disciplined coordination. This is not Eben-Emael's surprise. The defenders are ready, waiting, expecting this attack. Koch's training takes over. He exits the aircraft at 400 feet, the low German jump altitude that minimizes time under parachute but maximizes impact force. His canopy deploys properly, but around him, chaos unfolds. Paratroopers exit into streams of machine gun fire, dying before their feet leave the aircraft. Parachutes bloom, then suddenly collapse as bullets tear through canopies. Men land in trees, on rocks, in trenches occupied by enemy soldiers who bayonet them before they can cut free from their harnesses. The landing zone becomes a slaughter ground. Lieutenant Erich Schultz's transport takes concentrated fire during its approach, killing 6 paratroopers inside the aircraft before they can jump. Schultz pushes out anyway, landing 20 meters from a New Zealand machine gun position. He draws his pistol, the only weapon German paratroopers carry during descent, their rifles dropped separately in containers, and charges the position, firing wildly. The New Zealand crew cuts him down before he covers 5 meters. His body lies in the grass as more paratroopers land around him, each emerging from parachute harnesses armed only with pistols and gravity knives against defenders equipped with rifles, machine guns, and mortars. The fundamental vulnerability of airborne assault, glimpsed at the bridges during Ibn Emael, now manifests in full horror. Paratroopers are most vulnerable during descent and immediately after landing, separated from heavy weapons, disorganized by scattered landings, facing enemies in prepared positions. Prison Valley, south of Chania, experiences even worse catastrophe. 2nd Parachute Regiment drops directly onto positions held by New Zealand 23rd Battalion. Colonel Joseph Harding's New Zealanders have been waiting in concealed positions for 3 days, warned by British intelligence that precisely predicted German landing zones and timing. They hold fire as the first wave of transports approaches, then unleash coordinated volleys when paratroopers are most vulnerable, suspended under canopies, unable to maneuver or return fire. The massacre is systematic. 400 German paratroopers land in Prison Valley in the first wave. Within 30 minutes, 320 are dead or wounded. Survivors huddle in olive groves and stone walls, pinned down by fire from positions they cannot locate. The second wave arrives 20 minutes later, and New Zealand machine gunners simply repeat their execution drill. German casualties mount exponentially, 500, 700, 1,000 men down by mid-morning. Student receives casualty reports at his headquarters in Athens and experiences visceral shock. First-day casualties exceed all pre-invasion estimates combined. 1st Assault Regiment at Malem has lost 60% of its strength, over 1,200 men killed or wounded. 2nd Regiment is effectively destroyed. 3rd Regiment, dropping at Rethymno, is surrounded and unable to advance. 4th Regiment at Heraklion faces similarly desperate conditions. By noon on May 20th, German forces on Crete have suffered nearly 4,000 casualties, 1,990 killed, 1,995 wounded, from a landing force of 10,000. The casualty rate is apocalyptic, unsustainable, unprecedented in modern military operations. Student faces the moment every commander dreads, the point where continuing the operation means accepting catastrophic losses, but abandoning it means admitting defeat. Göring is in Athens, demanding updates, promising reinforcements. Student makes the only decision possible given political reality. Continue the assault, commit reserves, take Malem Airfield at any cost. The battle for Malem Airfield on May 21st determines the invasion's outcome. German forces control the eastern edge of the airfield, but face determined New Zealand defenders holding the western approaches and surrounding hills. Student orders every available transport aircraft to attempt landings on the contested runway, essentially using unarmed Ju-52s as assault craft. The first wave arrives at 8:30 in the morning. New Zealand artillery and mortar fire brackets the runway. Machine guns positioned on Point 107 Hill overlook the landing strip with perfect fields of fire. The Ju-52s come in anyway, landing under fire, stopping on the runway long enough to disgorge 5th Mountain Division infantry, then attempting to take off again while tracers stream past their fuselages. Some make it, most do not. Aircraft pile up on the runway, damaged, destroyed, burning. Ground crews drag wreckage aside to clear landing paths. More transports arrive, crash land on damaged gear, spill out troops who immediately go into assault formations. The audacity succeeds through sheer brutal persistence. By nightfall on May 21st, Maleme Airfield is partially operational despite being under continuous artillery fire. German forces have landed over 5,300 mountain infantry and Fallschirmjäger reinforcements, suffering horrific casualties in the process. 271 Ju-52 transports destroyed or damaged beyond repair, representing half of Germany's entire airborne transport fleet. But the numerical advantage begins shifting. German forces now outnumber the New Zealand defenders around Maleme and bring heavy weapons that paratroopers lacked. The New Zealand commander, Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew, recognizes his position is untenable and orders withdrawal during the night of May 21st. The decision is militarily sound but strategically fatal. Without Maleme, British forces on Crete cannot receive supplies or reinforcements. The battle shifts from German invasion to British evacuation. The next 6 days become a running battle as German forces push east along Crete's northern coast, while British and Commonwealth forces conduct fighting withdrawals toward evacuation beaches at Sfakia. Fallschirmjäger units, reinforced by mountain infantry and armor, reduce defensive positions methodically. Casualties continue mounting on both sides. German forces lose another 3,700, killed or wounded during the advance, bringing total German casualties to over 7,000. British and Commonwealth forces suffer 14,000 casualties, including evacuees who drown when Royal Navy vessels are sunk during extraction operations. By May 27th, organized resistance on Crete ends. Germany controls the island. The cost breaks Student's soul. He arrives on Crete on May 28th to tour the battlefields and meet surviving commanders. What he witnesses destroys any triumphalism the victory might warrant. Maleme Airfield is a graveyard. Wrecked aircraft still smolder. Olive groves are carpeted with German dead. Medical stations overflow with wounded men whose screams carry across the landing zones. Student visits field hospitals where doctors perform amputations without anesthesia because medical supplies were dropped in the wrong zones or destroyed. He speaks with company commanders who started the invasion with 130 men and now lead 20. In one olive grove, Student counts 43 German parachutes still hanging in the trees, their wearers dead in their harnesses, killed before they could cut themselves free. That night, Student dictates his preliminary after-action report, and one sentence captures the operation's fundamental character. We have won Crete, but we have lost the Fallschirmjäger. The numbers support his assessment brutally. Total German casualties for Operation Mercury reached 6,698 killed, wounded, and missing from 22,000 committed forces, a 30% casualty rate in 10 days. More critically, the Fallschirmjäger specifically suffered 3,714 dead, almost 40% of all German parachute-qualified soldiers. Elite units that took years to train and equip have been devastated in a week. The transport aircraft losses are equally catastrophic. Germany's airborne lift capacity has been cut in half, and aircraft production cannot replace losses for at least 18 months. Student's report reaches Hitler's headquarters in early June, and the Führer's response becomes immediate policy. The day of parachute troops is over. The parachute arm is a surprise weapon, and the surprise has been used up. No more large-scale airborne operations. Germany's Fallschirmjäger will fight as elite infantry, but the skies will no longer be their battlefield. August 1941, Stendal Parachute Training Center, Germany. The jump towers stand empty against a cloudless summer sky, their cables still and silent. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, survivor of Crete's Prison Valley massacre, sits on a bench near the loading platform, where he completed his first jumps 2 years earlier. Around him, other Crete veterans wait for reassignment orders that never come. The training center operates at perhaps 20% capacity, new recruits process through in small groups. But the massive expansion of 1940 has ended. The empty towers symbolize a larger reality. Hitler's directive has created institutional paralysis. Germany maintains over 30,000 trained paratroopers, but doctrine for their employment no longer exists. They are elite soldiers without elite missions. Warriors trained for vertical warfare, now grounded indefinitely. Müller watches a recruit class practice parachute landing falls on mats and thinks of the friends who died, tangled in olive trees on Crete. He wonders what their deaths achieved. The Fallschirmjäger dispersal begins in autumn 1941 with quiet bureaucratic efficiency. 2nd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, rebuilt to half strength after Crete's losses, deploys to occupation duty in Corinth, Greece. Their mission is anti-partisan operations, tracking down Greek resistance fighters, securing supply routes, garrisoning isolated villages. It is police work, brutal and inglorious. Lieutenant Franz Weber, who led an assault section at Maleme, now commands checkpoints and conducts house-to-house searches for weapons. His diary entries from October 1941 capture the demoralization. Yesterday we raided a village suspected of harboring partisans, found 3 shotguns and some British supplies. Today we built a new checkpoint. This is what elite forces do: search peasants' homes for shotguns. The Führer's elite, the warriors who took Crete. Now we're military police in a backwater. The corrosive effect on morale spreads through the regiment. Soldiers trained for the war's most dangerous missions now serve occupation duty indistinguishable from regular Wehrmacht infantry. 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, Germany's most veteran formation, remains in Germany through winter 1941, conducting training exercises that everyone knows are theatrical. The division lacks transport aircraft for airborne operations and heavy equipment for sustained ground combat. It occupies a liminal space, too specialized for regular infantry work, too immobile for airborne operations, too valuable to waste, but too limited to employ effectively. Student presides over this stasis from 6th Fliegerkorps headquarters, his command now administrative rather than operational. He drafts contingency plans for airborne operations that will never be executed: seizure of Gibraltar, invasion of Malta, drops behind Soviet lines. The plans are professionally crafted fantasies, exercises in military planning disconnected from any possibility of implementation. Student knows this, but continues because stopping means acknowledging that his life's work has become irrelevant. The equipment paradox compounds the force's identity crisis. Germany continues producing Fallschirmjäger-specific gear, despite having no doctrinal justification for its use. Gravity knives, jump smocks, distinctive helmets, specialized parachutes, all flow from factories into depots where they are issued to soldiers who will never jump into combat. The FG-42 rifle, an engineering marvel specifically designed for airborne operations, enters production in late 1941. This selective fire weapon, capable of both semi-automatic and full-automatic fire, weighing only 4.1 kilograms, represents cutting-edge small arms technology. 9,000 units are ordered, but by the time production begins, Germany has abandoned large-scale airborne operations. The FG-42 becomes an expensive, over-engineered weapon issued to paratroopers who fight as conventional infantry. The absurdity escapes no one. Germany invests in specialized airborne equipment for an airborne capability it no longer employs. Spring 1942 brings partial resolution to the force's purpose. Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in North Africa, requests elite infantry reinforcements for his Africa Corps. Student proposes forming a specialized brigade from Fallschirmjäger veterans, nominally retaining airborne designation, but optimized for ground combat. The Rameke Parachute Brigade, named for its commander Hermann Bernhard Ramke, a hard-bitten veteran of First World War and Crete, forms in April 1942 with 4,200 paratroopers. They receive desert uniforms, tropical equipment, and anti-tank weapons, but retain their parachute boots, smocks, and insignia. The brigade becomes a microcosm of the larger force's evolution. Elite light infantry trading airborne mobility for desert adaptability, maintaining Fallschirmjäger identity while abandoning Fallschirmjäger missions. Rameke's men deploy to North Africa in July, knowing they will fight as ground troops, but clinging to the elite designation that distinguishes them from regular Wehrmacht forces. The 3 small-scale combat jumps executed between June 1941 and September 1943 illuminate the airborne force's marginal role. Operation Mercurius II, a battalion-sized drop near the Litani River in Lebanon, achieves tactical objectives but influences nothing strategic. A company-level jump in Tunisia disrupts Allied supply lines for 72 hours before the unit is overrun. Most telling is the Dnieper crossing operation in September 1943. a Soviet-style mass drop of 2,300 paratroopers behind Red Army lines that ends in catastrophe when Soviet forces encircle and destroy the isolated German units within 4 days. These operations share common characteristics: small scale, limited objectives, negligible strategic impact. They prove Germany retains technical capability for airborne operations, but demonstrate Hitler's judgment was correct. The element of surprise that made such operations decisive no longer exists. For the Fallschirmjäger themselves, identity becomes an abstract concept maintained through symbols rather than actions. Training continues with jump qualification. Even though combat jumps have essentially ceased, new recruits process through parachute school, complete their required jumps, receive their wings, and deploy to ground combat units. Veterans returning from garrison duty or hospital care maintain jump proficiency through periodic training drops that serve no operational purpose. The institution preserves traditions because letting them die means admitting the force has fundamentally changed. Regimental gatherings celebrate past victories: Eben Emael, Corinth Bridge, Malem Airfield. But these celebrations occur in barracks in France or Greece, where men train for ground combat missions. The Fallschirmjäger are becoming what student feared: elite infantry distinguished by historical reputation and distinctive uniforms rather than unique capabilities. Student himself becomes a figure of tragic irony. Promoted to General Oberst in recognition of pre-Crete achievements, he commands an airborne corps that no longer conducts airborne operations. His staff produces beautiful planning documents: aircraft allocation tables, drop zone analyses, sequential wave timing calculations that address questions no one is asking. In quiet moments, student reviews after-action reports from Crete and conducts his own tactical autopsy. What could have been done differently? Better intelligence on defensive positions, more concentrated drops to reduce dispersion, heavier weapons available immediately after landing, tactical improvements that miss the strategic reality. Vertical envelopment cannot survive against prepared, alerted defenders with adequate reserves. The Soviets learned this in their 1941 disasters. The Germans learned it on Crete. The British and Americans would learn it at Arnhem. Airborne warfare works magnificently in specific, narrowly defined circumstances and fails catastrophically when those circumstances don't exist. December 1942. A Fallschirmjäger training class completes its qualification jumps at Wittstock Training Center. 23 recruits earn their wings, receive their distinctive smocks, and learn they are being assigned to 1st Fallschirmjäger Division in France. They ask their instructors when they will conduct combat jumps. The instructors, veterans of Crete who know the answer, deflect with talk of operational security and future missions. The truth is simpler and more tragic. These new paratroopers will likely never jump into combat. They will fight as elite infantry, distinguished by training and equipment, but employed identically to regular Wehrmacht forces. The Fallschirmjäger remain elite because history and propaganda require it, because abandoning the identity would mean admitting resource investment was wasted. Because elite designation provides legitimacy that generic infantry status would not. But the warriors without a war know what they have become: symbols of innovation that failed, practitioners of warfare rendered obsolete by its own success, soldiers trapped between past glory and uncertain future. July 19, 1942. Tobruk, Libya. General Major Hermann Bernhard Rameke, 53 years old and scarred from 3 wars, steps from a transport aircraft onto sun-bleached tarmac and immediately begins sweating through his tropical uniform. Behind him, 4,200 Fallschirmjäger of Rameke Parachute Brigade disembark in waves, Germany's elite airborne forces arriving in North Africa, not as sky soldiers, but as desert infantry. Erwin Rommel greets Rameke personally, a rare honor reflecting the Africa Corps commander's desperate need for reliable troops. Rommel's forces are stretched thin across Libya and western Egypt, facing British 8th Army reinforcements arriving faster than German replacements. Finally, Rommel tells Rameke, "Troops I can depend on to hold positions without constant supervision." The Fallschirmjäger glance at each other uncertainly. They train to jump from aircraft and seize objectives through vertical assault. Now they will dig trenches in the desert and fight a positional war. The transformation from airborne elite to ground infantry, begun after Crete, enters its next phase. The brigade's composition reveals Germany's pragmatic adaptation to circumstances. 4,200 Fallschirmjäger form the core, veterans of Crete, occupation duty in Greece, and the aborted Operation Sea Lion. They retain their distinctive camouflage smocks despite the desert heat because identity matters as much as practicality. Attached to them is the Italian Folgore Parachute Division, 5,000 troops who share airborne designation, but barely adequate equipment. The Italian paratroopers impress German officers with their motivation, but concern them with their obsolete weapons and inadequate artillery support. Ramska organizes combined German-Italian battle groups, placing German heavy weapons teams with Italian infantry companies, creating tactical formations that maximize Italian numbers while leveraging German firepower. The resulting force is neither fully German nor traditionally organized, reflecting North Africa's improvisational character. August brings the brigade's combat debut at Alam Halfa Ridge, southeast of El Alamein. British 8th Army, now under Bernard Montgomery's cautious command, launches a probing offensive designed to test German defenses. Ramecke's paratroopers hold the southern flank, positioned in hastily dug trenches offering minimal protection from the scorching sun or British artillery. The British attack comes at dawn on August 31st, armor and infantry advancing under artillery barrage that pounds German positions for 3 hours before the ground assault. Private Klaus Hartmann, machine gunner from 3rd Company, crouches in his slit trench as shells explode progressively closer, each detonation showering him with sand and rock fragments. When the barrage lifts, he emerges to find British tanks advancing 500 meters away, infantry following in open formation. Hartmann's MG-34 machine gun opens fire at extreme range, tracers arcing toward the advancing infantry. Similar fire erupts from positions up and down the German line, disciplined, controlled, devastatingly effective. The battle unfolds as textbook defensive combat. Fallschirmjäger machine gun teams pin British infantry while anti-tank guns engage armor at ranges where German technical superiority in gun design and ammunition penetration prove decisive. British tanks advance into pre-sighted kill zones where multiple German guns can concentrate fire. 3 Matilda tanks explode in quick succession, their crews dying before they can locate the anti-tank positions. British infantry, caught in open ground without armored support, go to ground and call for artillery support. The battle becomes an exchange of firepower, British numerical advantage and artillery superiority against German defensive preparation, and crew-served weapon proficiency. By afternoon, British forces withdraw, leaving behind 18 destroyed tanks and over 400 casualties. Ramecke's brigade has suffered 73 killed and 152 wounded, acceptable losses by desert warfare standards. But more importantly, they have stopped a British offensive cold. Montgomery draws the lesson Rommel expected. Ramecke's paratroopers are not ordinary infantry. They hold positions tenaciously, use cover expertly, and fight with initiative that allows small units to adapt to battlefield changes without waiting for orders. When Montgomery launches his major offensive at El Alamein on October 23rd, he deliberately avoids the southern sector held by Ramecke's brigade, concentrating instead against Italian and German infantry divisions in the north. The tactical complement becomes strategic irrelevance. If Montgomery can break through in the north, the southern flank becomes meaningless. Ramecke's Fallschirmjäger spend the 12-day second battle of El Alamein in their trenches, hearing the thunder of massed artillery to the north, watching supply columns retreat past their positions, understanding they are holding ground in a battle being lost elsewhere. On November 4th, Rommel orders general retreat. The Africa Corps begins its long withdrawal toward Tunisia, and Ramecke's brigade assumes the role that will define their African service, rearguard. The fighting retreat across Libya tests everything the Fallschirmjäger learned in training and exemplifies light infantry's harsh reality in mechanized warfare. British 8th Army pursues methodically, probing for weaknesses, engaging German rearguards, then waiting for flanking columns to threaten encirclement before resuming pursuit. Ramecki's paratroopers perfect the rhythm of defensive warfare, hold positions until threatened with envelopment, withdraw under covering fire, establish new positions. 15 kilometers west, repeat. Each iteration costs casualties Germany cannot replace. Lieutenant Werner Schultz's company starts the retreat with 120 men and reaches Tobruk 5 days later with 87 effectives. The missing 33 include 21 wounded evacuated and 12 killed in small actions that don't merit mention in official histories. This is how elite units die in desert warfare, not in climactic battles but through steady attrition that accumulates daily. The long walk becomes legendary in Fallschirmjäger lore. 280 kilometers of retreat across open desert when fuel shortages immobilize all German transport vehicles. Ramke orders his brigade to continue on foot, while Afrika Korps' mechanized units race ahead to new defensive positions. The Fallschirmjäger march at night to avoid British aircraft and daytime heat, each man carrying 40 kilograms of equipment and ammunition. Water runs short. Food becomes scarce. Stragglers drop from heat exhaustion and dehydration. British mechanized patrols harass the column, forcing frequent deployments into defensive positions that delay progress. What should take 4 days requires 11. When Ramecke's brigade reaches German lines at Mersa-Brega on November 19th, they have walked further than Napoleon's retreat from Moscow on a per-day basis, and they have done so while conducting a fighting retreat under constant enemy pressure. 400 men are missing, dead, captured, or simply lost in the desert. The survivors resemble scarecrows more than soldiers. Winter 1942 turns to spring 1943, and the operational situation deteriorates from bad to catastrophic. Allied forces land in Morocco and Algeria in November, creating a second front that dooms Axis forces in North Africa. Rommel withdraws into Tunisia, establishing a shrinking defensive perimeter while Hitler demands Tunisia be held to the last man. Ramecke's brigade, now reduced to 2,800 effectives, fights in the Kasserine Pass offensive in February, Germany's last successful counterattack in Africa. The Fallschirmjäger break through American defenses, inflict heavy casualties, take prisoners, and prove once again their combat effectiveness. Then, Allied reinforcements arrive, German supplies run out, and the offensive stalls. By March, the writing is on every wall. Tunisia will fall, and everyone fighting there will die or surrender. Hitler forbids evacuation. The elite paratroopers who arrived in Africa 8 months earlier now await inevitable capture. The end comes in stages between late April and mid-May 1943. Allied forces reduce the Axis perimeter systematically, cutting off Tunis and Bizerte, isolating remaining German units in pockets that cannot communicate or mutually support. Ramecke's brigade fights its final action at Cape Bon on May 10th, holding positions against British armor until ammunition exhausts. Ramecke surrenders personally on May 12th, formally handing over his unit's remaining weapons to a British brigadier. Behind him, 5,000 Fallschirmjäger march into prisoner of war camps, the survivors of a brigade that arrived 4,200 strong, reinforced with an additional 3,000 replacements during its African service. The mathematics are brutal. In 10 months, Ramecke Parachute Brigade suffered over 5,000 casualties, a 140% loss rate when replacements are factored. Across Tunisia, 15,000 additional Fallschirmjäger from various formations surrender between May 10th and May 13th. The entire North African commitment of Germany's elite airborne forces disappearing into Allied POWs camps. Kurt Student receives the final casualty reports in his Berlin headquarters and experiences the same hollowness he felt after Crete. The African campaign has consumed another generation of trained paratroopers, irreplaceable veterans with combat experience, leadership ability, and the institutional knowledge that distinguishes elite units from ordinary infantry. More troubling is the strategic futility. Ramecke's brigade fought superbly, held positions tenaciously, conducted textbook defensive operations, and achieved absolutely nothing. Tunisia fell on the same timetable it would have fallen had the Fallschirmjäger never deployed. The only difference is that Germany lost 20,000 elite soldiers who could have been employed elsewhere. Student drafts a memo questioning the wisdom of committing airborne forces to grinding attritional campaigns, where their light infantry organization and specialized training offer no advantages. The memo is ignored. Elite units get committed where commanders need reliable troops, regardless of whether those missions utilize their specialization. The pattern will repeat in Italy, France, Belgium, and Germany itself. Fallschirmjäger dying magnificently in battles where their elite status matters less than the number of men and guns, where training and tradition cannot overcome industrial arithmetic. November 12th, 1943, 0530 hours. Mediterranean airspace approaching Leros Island, Dodecanese. Hauptmann Martin Kühne crouches in the doorway of a Ju-52 transport, watching the island materialize from pre-dawn darkness. Behind him, 16 Fallschirmjäger from 1st Parachute Regiment wait in silence broken only by aircraft engine drone and the metallic click of men checking weapons for the 10th time. Kühne has jumped into combat twice before, Crete and a small operation in Tunisia, and both experiences taught him that the first seconds after landing determines survival. Below, Leros stretches across the sea, a rocky island of irregular hills and small valleys where British forces have been digging in for 6 weeks. German intelligence reports 1,200 defenders. Kühne suspects the number is low. What he knows with certainty is that this operation represents something unprecedented. Germany's first regimental-size combat jump in 2.5 years, the first major airborne operation since Hitler's post-Crete ban. The question every Fallschirmjäger has asked during planning remains unanswered. If Hitler banned airborne operations after Crete, why is this one happening? The answer lies in strategic desperation, masquerading as opportunism. Italy's September surrender created chaos in the Aegean, where Italian garrisons suddenly became targets for British occupation forces seeking to establish positions threatening Germany's southeastern flank. A minor British success in seizing several Dodecanese islands triggers disproportionate German response. Recover the islands, deny Britain forward bases, demonstrate to Balkan allies that Germany remains dominant. The Leros operation becomes possible because it perfectly fits the narrow parameters for successful airborne assault. Isolated objective, limited enemy forces, minimal reserves available for counterattack. Achievable within the lift capacity of available transport aircraft. Student recognizes this as potentially the last opportunity to conduct the type of operation he has prepared for throughout his career. He personally oversees planning with attention to detail bordering on obsession, determined that this operation will vindicate airborne warfare doctrine. The drop begins at 0615 as the first light spreads across the eastern sky. Kühne exits at 400 feet, his parachute deploying smoothly in the familiar shock and suspension. Around him, the sky fills with canopies as 1,300 Fallschirmjäger from 1st Parachute Regiment descend on 2 drop zones, one north of Leros town, another near Gurna Bay. British defenders open fire immediately, but without the concentrated volleys that devastated German paratroopers on Crete. The defensive difference is instantly apparent. British forces on Leros are garrison troops, not the elite Commonwealth forces that defended Crete. Their firing is sporadic rather than coordinated. Kühne lands in a vineyard, cuts himself free, and immediately begins organizing his scattered section. Within 10 minutes, he has collected 15 men and located one of the weapons containers dropped separately. This is how airborne operations are supposed to work. Rapid assembly, immediate offensive action, maintaining initiative before defenders can organize response. But the operation's elegance dissolves into the brutal physics of island combat. Leros is rock and hillside, offering minimal cover and excellent defensive observation positions. British troops, though not elite, have spent weeks preparing positions on high ground overlooking every approach. Mount Apatitsi, dominating the island's center, becomes the operation's focal point. German paratroopers must take the mountain to break British defensive coordination. But attacking uphill without artillery support against prepared positions inverts every tactical advantage airborne forces theoretically possess. The assault becomes grinding infantry combat, small units advancing under covering fire, taking casualties, falling back, regrouping, attacking again. Feldwebel Hans Dietrich leads his squad in 4 separate assaults on a British position halfway up Apatitsi, losing 3 men killed and 2 wounded before finally overrunning the position at bayonet point. The captured position gains them 50 meters of elevation. The summit remains 300 meters higher. The operation's success depends on maritime and aerial reinforcement reaching the island, while paratroopers tie down British defenders. On November 13th, German landing craft deposit 1,500 mountain troops on Leros' eastern beaches under covering fire from 87 dive bombers. The landing succeeds because British naval forces are absent, driven from the Aegean by overwhelming German air superiority. Over the next 48 hours, an additional 2,000 German troops arrive by sea and air, transforming the tactical equation from isolated paratroopers fighting uphill to combined arms assault with armor, artillery, and air support. British defenders, surrounded and facing forces triple their number, continue resisting with tenacity that surprises German commanders. The battle for Mount Apatitsi continues for 72 hours, positions changing hands multiple times, combatants reduced to throwing grenades in close quarters, fighting where the range is measured in meters. November 16th, 14:30 hours. The British commander, Brigadier Robert Tilney, accepts that further resistance is futile. German forces control all high ground, command every approach, and have isolated his remaining troops into pockets that cannot mutually support. He orders surrender. And 3,200 British and Italian prisoners march into captivity. German casualties for the 5-day operation total 520 killed and wounded, less than 10% of committed forces, remarkably light for an opposed amphibious and airborne assault. The Leros victory becomes instant propaganda triumph. Newsreels show Fallschirmjäger descending on the island, German soldiers raising the swastika flag on Mount Apatitsi, British prisoners filing past cameras. The narrative writes itself. Germany's airborne forces remain potent. Vertical envelopment remains viable. Hitler's post-Crete pessimism has been disproven. Student travels to Leros for the obligatory victory tour, walking battlefields still littered with British equipment and German parachutes caught in rocky outcroppings. He meets with Kuno and other company commanders, collecting tactical observations for after-action reports. The conversation reveals telling details. Paratroopers landed scattered across rough terrain, taking over an hour to achieve unit cohesion. Weapon containers frequently landed in inaccessible locations, leaving assault teams armed only with pistols and grenades for extended periods. Radio communications failed repeatedly due to terrain interference. British defensive fire, though less concentrated than Crete, still inflicted disproportionate casualties during the vulnerable descent and landing phases. The operation succeeded primarily because follow-on forces arrived quickly with heavy weapons, and because British defenders were isolated without reinforcement possibility. In short, Leros vindicated airborne doctrine only within extremely narrow parameters that would rarely occur in major operations. The resource commitment required for this minor operation reveals airborne warfare's fundamental strategic problem. Germany committed its entire available transport aircraft fleet, 600 Ju-52s and Ju-87s, to support 1,300 paratroopers and deliver follow-on forces to a single small island. The Luftwaffe flew over 600 sorties in 5 days, consuming fuel and aircraft maintenance capacity that other fronts desperately needed. When student calculates the resource-to-outcome ratio, the mathematics prove damning. Leros required the same aircraft commitment as Crete, which involved 10,000 paratroopers attacking a major island, to deliver 1,300 soldiers and achieve a tactical victory with zero strategic significance. 18 months after Leros, when British forces evacuated the Dodecanese without German interference, the operation's irrelevance became complete. Every German casualty, every expenditure of scarce resources, every transport aircraft dedicated to Leros could have been employed more productively elsewhere. The operation's true significance emerges in what it demonstrates about airborne warfare's evolution. Leros is Germany's last successful regimental-scale combat jump of World War II. After Leros, Fallschirmjäger conduct only one more significant airborne operation, the battalion-sized rescue of Mussolini from Gran Sasso in September 1943, a special operation rather than conventional military assault. The silence following Leros speaks volumes. If airborne operations remain viable and cost-effective, why does Germany essentially abandon them after this success? The answer is unspoken, but understood throughout the Luftwaffe command structure. Airborne assault works when surprise is total, enemy forces are limited, reinforcement timelines favor the attacker, and defenders lack mobility or reserves. These conditions increasingly disappear as Allied forces expand, defensive doctrine improves, and Germany's resource constraints make committing entire transport fleets to single objectives unsustainable. Student has proven airborne warfare remains technically possible. He has not proven it remains strategically relevant. December 1943. Student reviews the Leros after-action report in his Berlin office, marking paragraphs for emphasis, underlining casualty statistics, calculating resource expenditures. He drafts a cover memo framing the operation as vindication of airborne doctrine and proof that Fallschirmjäger remain Germany's premier assault forces. He does not mention that the operation required conditions unlikely to recur, or that the victory achieved nothing of lasting importance, or that committing Germany's entire transport fleet to seize one island represents resource allocation no nation can sustain in a multi-front war. The memo circulates through Luftwaffe command and receives polite acknowledgement. No new airborne operations are authorized. Student understands he has commanded the Fallschirmjäger's last hurrah. The next time German paratroopers engage in large-scale combat, they will do so on the ground, fighting as infantry. Leros is the exception that proves Hitler's rule. The day of parachute troops is indeed over. The surprise weapon has been used up. February 15, 1944, 09:30 hours. Monte Cassino, Italy. Obergefreiter Joseph Weber crouches in a stone cellar beneath the town's ruins as the earth itself seems to come apart. For 3 hours, Allied bombers have been systematically destroying the ancient Benedictine abbey crowning the mountain above his position. 229 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-25 Mitchells drop 1,452 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs on a structure that has stood for 1,400 years. Weber, a veteran of Crete and North Africa, has survived artillery barrages and naval bombardments, but nothing compares to this. Each explosion sends shockwaves through the bedrock itself. Dust cascades from the cellar ceiling. His ears bleed from overpressure. When the bombing finally stops, silence rings louder than the explosions. Weber climbs into daylight and stares upward at what remains of the abbey, a skeletal ruin of broken walls and smoking rubble. His battalion commander, Major Ludwig Heilmann, surveys the destruction and smiles grimly. Now, Heilmann says, we have the perfect defensive position. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Division arrived at Monte Cassino in January 1944 with orders to hold the Gustav Line, Germany's defensive barrier across Italy's narrow waist, anchored on the Cassino Massif. The position's strategic value is absolute. Highway 6, the only practical route to Rome from southern Italy, passes through the Liri Valley directly beneath Monte Cassino. Controlling the mountain means controlling the highway. Losing the mountain opens the road to Rome. For the 14,000 Fallschirmjäger deployed across Cassino town and the surrounding heights, the mission is simple in concept and brutal in execution. Stop the Allied advance regardless of cost. The paratroopers, now fighting as elite mountain infantry, have transformed from sky soldiers into the deadliest defensive fighters in the Wehrmacht. What follows over the next 4 months will prove both their tactical excellence and the horrific mathematics of defensive warfare in the industrial age. The First Battle of Cassino in January served as preparation for what February brings. American and British troops attacked the town and abbey from multiple directions, achieving limited penetrations before German counterattacks restored positions. The Fallschirmjäger learned the terrain intimately, which stone buildings offer cover from artillery, which approach routes are most vulnerable, where to position machine guns for overlapping fields of fire. They fortified cellars, prepared demolition charges in buildings to collapse routes of advance, stockpiled ammunition and distributed caches throughout the defensive zone. By February, 1st Fallschirmjäger Division has transformed Cassino into a killing ground where every street, every building, every rubble pile is incorporated into defensive plans. The Allied bombing of the Abbey represents a tactical gift. The intact structure limited defensive options, but the rubble creates perfect positions for snipers, machine gun nests, and observation posts. The New Zealand Corps assault begins on February 15th, immediately after the bombing, with 4th Indian Division attacking the Abbey ruins, while 2nd New Zealand Division assaults the town. The Indian troops advance up the mountain slopes expecting to find German defenders stunned and disorganized. Instead, Fallschirmjäger emerge from deep positions untouched by bombs that devastated surface structures. Machine gun fire from the Abbey ruins cuts down the 1st Indian Company within 200 meters of the summit. The surviving Indians go to ground among the rocks, pinned by fire from positions they cannot locate. Every attempt to advance draws immediate, accurate fire. By nightfall, 4th Indian Division has suffered 300 casualties and gained perhaps 50 meters. In Cassino Town, New Zealand infantry discovers that bombing has made their assault harder, not easier. Rubble blocks streets, creating choke points where German machine guns can concentrate fire. Buildings collapse into impassable barriers, forcing attackers into predictable routes. The battle devolves into close-quarters urban warfare of unprecedented savagery. Gefreiter Paul Boehmer, machine gunner with 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, spends 3 days in a hotel cellar, his MG-42 machine gun covering the intersection of Via Casalina and Via San Angelo. New Zealand infantry must cross this intersection to advance toward the Abbey. Boehmer's gun kills the first soldier who attempts the crossing, then the second, then the third. The New Zealanders bring up smoke grenades and lay suppressing fire, allowing small groups to dart across under cover. Boehmer fires through the smoke at sounds and movement, his assistant gunner feeding belt after belt into the weapon. Bodies accumulate in the intersection. New Zealand officers attempt flanking maneuvers, only to discover that every parallel street is similarly covered. By the 3rd day, Boehmer has fired over 4,000 rounds. His position has been located and receives near constant mortar fire, but the cellar provides sufficient protection. He continues firing until his barrel overheats and must be changed. The fighting reaches peak intensity during the 3rd week of February. New Zealand engineers attempt to blast through rubble barriers using explosive charges, creating new routes of advance that German observers immediately identify and target with pre-registered artillery fire. Indian troops on the mountain slopes fight yard by yard toward the Abbey, losing men to snipers positioned in rubble where they are effectively invisible. One Fallschirmjäger sniper, Obergefreiter Heinz Schreiber, achieves 43 confirmed kills in 6 days before a New Zealand counter-sniper locates his position and kills him with a headshot. Schreiber's replacement, also a trained marksman, accounts for another 19 kills before he too is killed. The casualty exchange continues. Fallschirmjäger, snipers inflicting disproportionate losses until they are themselves eliminated, then being immediately replaced from battalion reserves. The mathematical reality favors the defenders. Germany can sustain a 3-to-1 casualty ratio indefinitely because the Allies must attack across open ground, while Germans fight from prepared positions. March brings the 3rd battle, and the pattern repeats with variations born of desperation. Allied commanders recognize that frontal assault fails, so they attempt encirclement. New Zealand armor attempts to bypass Cassino Town through the Leary Valley, but discovers that German anti-tank positions on .593 Hill can engage any vehicle attempting the flanking maneuver. British infantry attacks along the Rapido River, attempting to penetrate the Gustav Line north of Cassino, but these attacks dissolve against minefields and machine gun positions. The Fallschirmjäger demonstrate tactical flexibility that conventional infantry lacks. When Allied forces achieve local penetrations, German counterattacks restore positions within hours. These counterattacks are not massive formations, but carefully coordinated small unit operations. A reinforced company infiltrates through ruins, approaches Allied penetration from an unexpected angle, launches assault with grenades and submachine guns at dawn, overwhelms surprise defenders before they can organize response. The technique works repeatedly because Fallschirmjäger, junior officers, and NCOs possess initiative and tactical judgment that allows adaptation without waiting for orders. The human cost accumulates inexorably. 1st Fallschirmjäger Division entered Casino with 14,000 effectives in January. By mid-March, combat strength has eroded to 9,000. The missing 5,000 include 2,100 killed and 2,900 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. The casualty rate, 36% in 2 months, would break ordinary units, but replacements arrive continuously, and veteran survivors maintain unit cohesion. The psychological toll manifests in ways statistics cannot capture. Weber's diary entry from March 20th reads, 22 days since I slept more than 3 hours consecutively. Cannot remember what silence sounds like. Dream every night of the cellar collapsing and burying me alive. This morning, we counterattacked toward the Continental Hotel. Killed 3 New Zealanders in hand-to-hand fighting. Don't remember their faces, only the moment. We're becoming something inhuman. The observation applies across the division, men fighting in conditions that reduce combat to pure survival instinct, where tactical excellence becomes mechanical and killing becomes routine. The 4th battle, beginning May 11th, brings overwhelming force that renders tactical excellence insufficient. Allied commanders commit 13 divisions, 21,000 troops with massive artillery support, against Gustav Linie positions held by 5 German divisions, including 1st Fallschirmjäger. The preliminary bombardment lasts 12 hours and expends more ammunition than the entire Italian campaign consumed in the previous month. The sheer weight of explosive transforms the battlefield. German positions that survived previous bombardments simply cease to exist, buried under tons of rubble or collapsed by direct hits. Polish Second Corps attacks the abbey from the north with fanatical determination, accepting catastrophic casualties to gain each meter of elevation. French Expeditionary Corps penetrates the Aurunci Mountains west of Cassino, threatening to encircle the entire German defensive position. For the first time in 4 months, the Fallschirmjäger face the tactical nightmare that dooms all defensive positions, encirclement rendering their carefully prepared fortifications irrelevant. The final defense of Cassino becomes a fighting withdrawal, executed with professional precision despite approaching collapse. Fallschirmjäger hold positions until encirclement becomes imminent, then withdraw to secondary positions under covering fire, delay pursuing forces, repeat. Polish troops reach the abbey ruins on May 17th, finding only German dead and wounded too severely injured to evacuate. The main body of 1st Fallschirmjäger Division has withdrawn during the previous night, marching north toward new defensive positions along the Hitler line. They leave behind a town that no longer exists, every building collapsed, every street cratered, every structure reduced to rubble indistinguishable from the earth itself. Allied casualties for the 4 Cassino battles total 55,000 killed and wounded. German casualties across all defending units reached 20,000, with 1st Fallschirmjäger Division accounting for 7,000 of that total. The casualty exchange ratio, 3-to-1 in Germany's favor, demonstrates defensive effectiveness, but proves strategically meaningless. Cassino fell. The road to Rome opened. The Gustav Line collapsed. Student receives 1st Fallschirmjäger Division's after-action report in late May and experiences conflicting emotions. His paratroopers have proven themselves the Wehrmacht's premier defensive infantry, holding against overwhelming odds, inflicting unsustainable casualties on attackers, maintaining unit cohesion through conditions that broke conventional formations. The report contains commendations for extraordinary valor, men who held positions for days without relief, junior officers who led counterattacks against superior forces, machine gunners who expended their own body weight in ammunition. But beneath the tactical success lies strategic futility that student cannot ignore. First, Fallschirmjäger. Division entered Casino at 14,000 strong and emerged with 2,100 combat effectives, an 85% casualty rate in 4 months. Every casualty was an irreplaceable veteran, trained at enormous expense, embodying institutional knowledge that cannot be recreated quickly. Germany won every tactical engagement at Casino and lost the strategic battle completely. The Allies advanced to Rome. The Fallschirmjäger paid the butcher's bill. Student drafts a memo questioning whether elite forces should be consumed in defensive attrition battles where their specialized training offers no advantage over regular infantry. The memo joins others like it, professionally written, statistically rigorous, strategically sound, and completely ignored. Elite units are committed where battles are critical, where reliable troops are needed, where commanders trust subordinates to hold regardless of odds. The cost becomes secondary to the mission. Monte Cassino is over. The pattern will repeat. November 1943. Tempelhof. Airport, Berlin. Kurt student stands on the tarmac, watching recruits board transport aircraft for parachute training. Young men whose average age is 19, whose military experience averages 6 weeks, who will complete 5 jumps and be declared Fallschirmjäger. The student has just received his new assignment orders, and the irony borders on cruel. He is to command 1st Parachute Army, a formation that exists primarily on organizational charts and in desperate wishful thinking. The title sounds formidable, an entire army of elite paratroopers. The reality is a bureaucratic fiction designed to absorb Germany's manpower dregs under a prestigious label. Student examines the orders again, hoping to find something missed in first reading. 1st Parachute Army will comprise 10 Fallschirmjäger divisions, theoretically 170,000 troops, organized under Luftwaffe command, but employed as ground infantry. What the orders do not mention is that these divisions exist at cadre strength, that most troops designated Fallschirmjäger will never jump from aircraft, that the entire structure is an administrative convenience rather than military reality. The force generation process begins immediately and reveals German manpower crisis in miniature. True Fallschirmjäger, jump-qualified veterans with combat experience, number perhaps 20,000 across all remaining formations. These men form divisional cadres, providing NCO leadership and institutional continuity. Everyone else comes from whoever the Wehrmacht can scrape together. Luftwaffe field divisions, formed from excess Air Force ground personnel and proven catastrophically ineffective in Russia, are disbanded and their survivors designated Fallschirmjäger. Kriegsmarine coastal defense units, made redundant by Allied control of surrounding seas, are transferred wholesale to parachute divisions. Stragglers and survivors from Eastern Front formations destroyed in Soviet offensives arrive at assembly areas and discover they are now paratroopers. The redesignation is purely administrative. They receive Fallschirmjäger uniforms and unit designations, but no specialized training. The idea that these men constitute elite forces would be laughable if the situation weren't desperate. March 1944 brings student to his army headquarters in Arnhem, Netherlands, where he confronts the gap between organizational charts and operational reality. On paper, 1st Parachute Army controls 8 Fallschirmjäger, divisions numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10. The discontinuous numbering reflecting divisions destroyed and not reformed. These divisions theoretically comprise 85,000 troops. Students' first staff meeting reveals the actual situation. 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, Germany's most veteran formation, is rebuilding in Italy after Cassino and is not available. 2nd Division exists at 60% strength, mostly undertrained replacements. 3rd Division comprises 4,200 men versus 14,000 authorized. 6th Division has been assembled from Luftwaffe Field Division survivors and averages 3 weeks of military training. 7th Division exists as a headquarters with attached independent battalions totaling perhaps 3,000 troops. Students' Army is a collection of understrength, ill-equipped, partially trained formations whose only common element is the Fallschirmjäger designation. The equipment crisis compounds personnel problems exponentially. Student's quartermaster briefs him on supply status using charts that detail systemic collapse. Small arms availability sits at 40% of authorized. Divisions requiring 16,000 rifles possess 7,000. Machine gun allocations are worse. Companies authorized 12 MG-42s receive 4. Mortars, already scarce, are distributed so thinly that most companies have 1 or 2 tubes instead of 6. Artillery support has become theoretical. Divisions authorized 48 guns operate with 12, and ammunition supply allows perhaps 20 rounds per gun per day. Motor vehicles represent the cruelest joke. 1st Parachute Army is authorized 6,800 trucks, but receives 820. This means divisions lack tactical mobility, cannot reposition quickly, cannot conduct mobile defense or rapid counterattacks. They can hold positions and fight as static infantry, nothing more. The training situation reveals how desperately Germany scrapes the barrel in the late war period. Student visits 6th Fallschirmjäger Division training areas in April and watches recruits practice basic infantry tactics, fire and movement, weapons handling, grenade throwing. Oberst Friedrich August von der Heide, commanding the division, walks student through their capabilities with brutal honesty. 75% of the division has never thrown a live grenade. Training stocks have been exhausted and replacements delayed. 40% have fired fewer than 20 rifle rounds. Ammunition rationing extends even to training. 20% cannot properly maintain their weapons. Previous military experience as Luftwaffe radar operators or naval cooks provided no relevant skills. Jump qualification rates tell the story most clearly. 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, 60% jump qualified. 2nd Division, 45%. 6th Division, 15%. 7th Division, 8%. The last figure especially stuns. Student of Fallschirmjäger Division, where 92% of troops have never parachuted, is elite only in designation, not capability. May 1944 brings the absurdity to its logical conclusion when student attends a conference where Wehrmacht planners discuss employing 1st Parachute Army as mobile reserve for coastal defense. The discussion proceeds normally until someone notes the fundamental problem. This mobile reserve lacks vehicles for mobility, lacks heavy weapons for offensive operations, lacks training for combined arms warfare. An awkward silence follows before discussion continues, everyone tacitly agreeing to ignore operational impossibilities. Student understands the dynamic. 1st Parachute Army exists because German command structure requires forces on organizational charts to oppose Allied forces on theirs. That these paper formations cannot execute assigned missions is secondary. They absorb manpower that would otherwise remain unorganized. They fill spaces on defensive maps. They provide reassuring briefings to superiors where division markers suggest strength that field reality contradicts. Student is commanding a fiction, and everyone involved understands this while pretending otherwise. The one area where 1st Parachute Army maintains genuine distinction is personnel quality at the small unit leadership level. Even diluted divisions retain veteran NCOs and junior officers whose combat experience and tactical judgment exceed regular Wehrmacht infantry equivalents. These veterans, scattered throughout formations as squad leaders and platoon commanders, provide disproportionate combat effectiveness. A partially trained company with experienced squad leaders can execute basic infantry tactics competently. The same company with inexperienced leadership at all levels becomes a mob. Student recognizes this and prioritizes distributing veterans as widely as possible, rather than concentrating them in elite battalions. The decision reflects grim calculus. 1st Parachute Army will fight as conventional infantry, so conventional infantry leadership matters more than airborne specialization. The Fallschirmjäger identity becomes primarily morale device, a designation that makes undertrained conscripts believe they are special, that motivates them to fight harder, that provides cohesion when material reality offers none. June 1944. Allied forces land in Normandy, and students' 1st Parachute Army remains in Netherlands. too far north to influence the battle and lacking transport to redeploy quickly even if ordered. Student watches the situation develop. Wehrmacht forces in France crumbling under Allied material superiority. German reserves committed piecemeal and destroyed. Defensive lines collapsing sequentially. He knows 1st Parachute Army's turn is coming. When Allied breakthrough forces reach Netherlands, his paper army will face its first genuine test. The prospect fills him with dread. He commands 85,000 troops whose designation suggests elite capability, but whose reality is untrained conscripts with inadequate equipment playing at being paratroopers. The Fallschirmjäger name carries weight earned by men who jumped into Crete and held Casino. That reputation will allow students' forces to surprise enemies expecting German incompetence. But reputation cannot substitute for training, and tradition cannot replace anti-tank guns. And historical glory cannot overcome Allied material advantage. Student drafts a final assessment for his records, writing candidly because no superior will read it. 1st Parachute Army is elite in name only. We are a paper formation waiting to be tested by reality. I fear the result. July 1944 brings the ultimate personnel indignity when student receives notification that 1st Parachute Army's strength will be increased by 14,000 men, former Soviet prisoners of war who have volunteered for Wehrmacht service rather than remain in camps. These Osttruppen, or Eastern Troops, are distributed across students' divisions with instructions that they be organized into separate companies under German leadership. Student meets with several Osttruppen officers through translators and finds them competent, motivated by hatred of Stalin's regime, and completely unprepared for Western Front combat. They have received minimal training with German weapons, speak little German, and possess equipment that makes student supply situation look generous. The decision to assign them to elite parachute formations reflects Wehrmacht logic. Distribute unreliable troops among reliable units to maximize their utility. Student integrates them as ordered, creating a force that now includes jump-qualified Crete veterans, Luftwaffe radar operators with 3 weeks training, Kriegsmarine coastal gunners redesignated as infantry, and former Red Army soldiers fighting for Germany. 1st Parachute Army, elite of the elite. August brings a moment of unexpected clarity during students' inspection's tour of 7th Fallschirmjäger Division. He watches a platoon conduct fire and movement drills, standard infantry tactics executed adequately but without distinction. The platoon includes 2 Crete veterans, 6 former Luftwaffe ground crew, 3 ex-Kriegsmarine sailors, and 1 Russian volunteer. They wear identical Fallschirmjäger smocks, carry the same weapons, answer to the same rank structure. The Crete veterans move with practiced efficiency, anticipating each movement. The former ground crew execute mechanically but competently. The sailors struggle with basics. The Russian performs adequately. Student realizes he is watching the Wehrmacht itself in miniature, an organization that once exemplified military excellence now sustained by mixing remnants of elite formations with whatever manpower can be found. The platoon is labeled elite because 2 men out of 12 have earned that designation. The label itself becomes the fiction that motivates the other 10 to approximate elite performance. Student has built a house of cards that looks formidable from certain angles and collapses under close examination. All that remains is discovering which wind will blow it down. September the 17th, 1944, 13:05 hours. Oosterbeek, Netherlands. Kurt Student stands on the balcony of his headquarters building, field glasses pressed to his face, watching the sky darken with aircraft. For a moment, time collapses. He could be in Athens in May 1941, watching his own transports approach Crete, feeling the anticipation and dread of launching thousands of men into uncertain fate. But today, he is the defender, and the aircraft descending on Dutch countryside carry British paratroopers executing the largest airborne operation in history. Operation Market Garden aims to seize bridges across the Rhine and its tributary rivers, creating a corridor for Allied armor to race into Germany's industrial heartland. Student watches the British 1st Airborne Division descend near Arnhem, their parachutes filling the sky in a spectacle he himself orchestrated 3 years earlier. His first reaction is professional admiration. The drop is concentrated, well-organized, textbook execution. His second thought comes with cold satisfaction. They are making the same mistakes we made. They are landing too far from their objectives. They are giving us time to respond. The irony is so perfect it borders on cosmic joke. Student architect of Germany's airborne forces now commands 1st Parachute Army, defending against Allied airborne assault. The lessons he learned at terrible cost on Crete, that paratroopers are most vulnerable immediately after landing, that rapid response crushes airborne operations, that isolating landing zones and preventing link-up with ground forces is paramount, are about to be demonstrated from the defender's perspective. Within 30 minutes of the first British parachute opening, student is issuing orders based on doctrine written in blood on Greek hillsides. Occupy all approach routes to the landing zones. Position blocking forces between paratroopers and their objectives. Attack immediately before the enemy consolidates. Prevent reinforcement at all costs. The orders flow with practiced ease because student has gamed this scenario mentally for 3 years. Imagining how he would defeat an airborne operation based on everything Crete taught him. The German forces available to student are the paper army assembled from Netherlands occupation duties, 2nd, 6th, 7th, and 8th Fallschirmjäger divisions at varying strengths and training levels, supplemented by SS Panzer units refitting nearby after escaping France. On paper, this represents overwhelming force against scattered airborne divisions. The reality is more complex. Most of students' paratroopers are inexperienced. Many units lack heavy weapons and transport. Coordination between dispersed formations is problematic, but student possesses the critical advantage of interior lines. His forces can concentrate against isolated British positions, while the British must fight in scattered pockets until ground relief arrives. The mathematics favors defense. Student issues movement orders to every unit within 50 kilometers of Arnhem, converge on the British landing zones, establish blocking positions, prevent the paratroopers from reaching Arnhem Bridge. Speed matters more than organization. A chaotic response executed immediately beats a coordinated response that arrives too late. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Parachute Battalion reaches Arnhem Bridge's northern end by nightfall on September 17th and establishes defensive positions in surrounding buildings. Frost has approximately 700 men, light weapons, and no anti-tank guns. They control one end of the bridge but cannot cross it because German forces hold the southern end. This is exactly the tactical situation student feared at Maleme, a small, determined force seizing a critical objective but lacking strength to exploit it. The difference is that at Maleme, German reinforcements arrived by air despite opposition. At Arnhem, British reinforcements must advance overland through German-controlled territory. Student positions 9th SS Panzer Division at the bridge's southern approach, not to assault across it. Attacking into prepared positions favors defenders, but to isolate it, preventing British relief from reaching Frost. 2nd Fallschirmjäger Regiment deploys around British landing zones west of Arnhem, blocking reinforcement routes. The tactical pattern student feared experiencing on Crete now unfolds exactly as he designed it. Aggressive immediate response, preventing airborne forces from consolidating or executing their operational plan. The next 8 days become a textbook demonstration of how to defeat airborne operations. British forces landing west of Arnhem attempt to advance into the city, but encounter German blocking positions at every intersection. The fighting resembles casino in miniature, urban combat, where defenders use buildings and rubble to channel attackers into kill zones, where machine guns cover every approach, where each block requires separate assault. But, unlike Casino, these British attackers are light infantry without armored support or heavy artillery, fighting enemies who possess both. 6th Fallschirmjäger Division, students' weakest formation, comprising mostly former Luftwaffe ground crew, finds itself blocking British advance along Utrecht-Zeeweg. These undertrained troops, many of whom student doubted would fight effectively, perform surprisingly well in defensive positions with veteran NCO leadership. A company commanded by a Crete veteran holds a railway embankment for 2 days against repeated British assaults, inflicting casualties far beyond their numerical advantage simply through defensive positioning and machine gun coverage. Frost's battalion at Arnhem Bridge endures siege conditions that mirror Emael, but with roles reversed. German forces surround the British positions, pound them with artillery and mortar fire, methodically reduce the defensive perimeter. SS troops assault repeatedly, each attack pushing British defenders back a few meters. The British lack ammunition to sustain return fire, food to maintain strength, medical supplies to treat mounting casualties. On September 20th, German forces capture the buildings on the bridge's northern ramp, leaving Frost's remnants isolated in structures immediately adjacent to the bridge. The parallels to German paratroopers' experience in urban combat are exact. Surrounded, outnumbered, low on ammunition, holding positions solely through determination and small unit defensive skill. But determination has its limits. By September 21st, German forces have reduced Frost's position to approximately 200 effectives, holding a single large building. That afternoon, after 4 days of continuous combat, Frost is wounded and his position overrun. British survivors surrender. Arnhem Bridge remains in German hands. The British perimeter contracts around Oosterbeek as relief efforts stall south of the Rhine. British ex-SXX Corps, advancing up a single highway from Belgium, encounters German resistance at every bridge and village, their progress measured in kilometers per day, rather than the rapid advance market garden planning assumed. Student positions elements of 7th and 8th Fallschirmjäger divisions along the southern bank of the Rhine, engaging British forces attempting to reinforce the Arnhem pocket across the river. German artillery registered on the river crossings makes reinforcement suicidal. Boats attempting to cross under cover of darkness are illuminated by flares and destroyed by pre-sighted guns. The isolated British paratroopers around Oosterbeek realize their situation is hopeless. Polish Parachute Brigade, dropped south of the Rhine on September 21st, cannot cross to assist them. Ground relief cannot break through. Supply drops land in German-controlled areas. The supplies immediately confiscated. On September 25th, British forces evacuate across the Rhine at night, abandoning wounded and equipment. Of 10,005 British paratroopers who landed, 2,400 escape. The rest are dead or captured. Student tours the Arnhem battlefield on September 27th. Walking positions British paratroopers defended with such determination. The debris of airborne warfare litters the ground. Parachutes hanging from trees, smashed gliders in fields, weapon containers that landed miles from their intended zones. Student examines a British anti-tank gun position that held off German armor for hours before being overrun, noting the tactical placement and fields of fire. He visits aid stations where captured British wounded receive treatment, speaking briefly with several officers who recognize him from his reputation. One British major, wounded in both legs, asks student how German forces responded so quickly. Student's answer is simple. We learned from our own experience. Everything you attempted, we tried first on Crete. Everything that destroyed you there, I incorporated into defensive doctrine. The British officer absorbs this, then asks what student thinks of airborne warfare's future. Student pauses before answering. I think September 1944 will be remembered as the month airborne operations died. You proved what we proved on Crete. That vertical envelopment, without overwhelming numerical advantage, without immediate link-up with ground forces, without total surprise, becomes suicide. The after-action analysis reveals how students' 1st Parachute Army, despite its paper tiger composition, defeated elite British airborne forces through doctrine rather than material superiority. German forces committed to the Arnhem battle included substantial numbers of undertrained Fallschirmjäger who would have been destroyed in offensive operations but performed adequately in defense with veteran leadership. The tactical environment favored them. Urban terrain negated Allied material advantages. Interior lines allowed concentration against isolated forces. Defensive positions multiplied combat effectiveness of even mediocre troops. But more than tactical circumstances, German success reflected doctrinal lessons learned at brutal cost. Students' orders from September 17th reflected everything Crete taught. Attack immediately, isolate landing zones, prevent objective seizure, stop reinforcement. The British, executing their first major airborne operation, learned those lessons in real time at similar cost. Market Garden casualties totaled 17,000 Allied, killed, wounded, and missing against 8,000 German casualties. The exchange ratio reflected airborne vulnerability that student understood viscerally. October 1944. Student attends a Wehrmacht conference where Market Garden is analyzed as strategic victory, demonstrating continued German combat effectiveness. Officers brief how 1st Parachute Army crushed Allied offensive, proving Wehrmacht retains capability to defeat numerically superior forces. Student listens to these assessments with growing unease. Market Garden succeeded not because German forces were strong, but because Allied airborne doctrine was flawed. The British attempted an operation at the extreme limit of airborne capability. Objectives too distant from landing zones, link-up dependent on rapid ground advance through defended territory, reinforcement vulnerable to interdiction. German success proved that competent defenders with interior lines can defeat airborne assaults, which is precisely what student already knew from Crete. The operation demonstrated nothing about German military capability beyond ability to exploit obvious Allied mistakes. Moreover, students' paper army performed adequately in defensive combat against an operationally flawed enemy plan. What happens when Allied forces attack with combined arms on favorable terrain? Student fears he already knows the answer. 1st Parachute Army won its first test through opponent error and circumstantial advantage. Future tests will prove less forgiving. October 19, 1944. Gardelegen Training Center, Germany. Hauptmann Ernst Fischer watches a recruit class practice parachute landing, falls on wooden platforms that simulate exiting aircraft. The recruits, 17 boys and 32-year-old fathers, pulled from reserved occupations, fumble through movements that should be automatic after 3 weeks of training. One recruit lands incorrectly, twisting his ankle. The injury would normally result in medical discharge, but Fischer signs a waiver, allowing continued training. The recruit limps through remaining exercises, clearly in pain, but determined to complete certification. Fischer's decision reflects grim reality. 1st Parachute. Army's manpower demands exceed supply of qualified volunteers. Everyone who starts training must finish regardless of physical limitations. These recruits will complete 5 jumps over the next week, receive Fallschirmjäger designation, and deploy to frontline units as replacements for Market Garden casualties. Their average training duration is 3 weeks. In 1940, similar training required 16 weeks. Fischer knows his recruits are inadequately prepared for combat. He also knows that adequacy is a luxury Germany can no longer afford. The systemic training collapse manifests most clearly in comparisons between cohorts entering service in different years. A Fallschirmjäger, certified in 1940, completed 16 weeks of training, including 8 parachute jumps, extensive weapons qualification, tactical exercises at squad through company level, and physical conditioning that ensured every soldier could run 10 kilometers with full equipment. That same soldier received parachute training using 1:8 instructor-to-student ratios, ensuring proper technique and safety. By 1944, training duration has contracted to 3 weeks minimum, 4 weeks average. Jump training consists of 5 jumps with 1:30 instructor ratios. Veterans watching masses of recruits exit aircraft, hoping to catch critical errors, but unable to provide individual instruction. Physical conditioning emphasizes minimal competence. Can the recruit march 5 kilometers and handle basic infantry tasks? Advanced training in small unit tactics has essentially ceased. Companies receive recruits who understand how to operate their individual weapons, but lack understanding of how squads coordinate fire and movement, how platoons execute assaults, how companies operate as coherent units. These gaps must be filled through on-the-job training in frontline positions, a pedagogy measured in casualties. The equipment crisis has progressed from serious to catastrophic by late 1944. Student's Army quartermaster briefs him monthly on supply status using reports that track steady degradation across every category. Small arms availability has declined from 40% of authorized strength in July to 35% in October. This means that in a theoretical Fallschirmjäger company of 140 men, 49 soldiers lack assigned rifles. They are issued captured weapons, French, Soviet, Polish rifles, with ammunition that may or may not be available when needed. Machine gun allocations fare worse. Companies receiving 3 MG42s instead of 12 attempt to compensate through tactical positioning, but 3 machine guns cannot provide defensive coverage that 12 guns enable. Mortars have become so scarce that most battalions operate with 4 tubes versus an authorized 18. Artillery support exists at approximately 20% of authorized. Divisions requiring 48 guns operate with 10, and those guns receive ammunition allocations of 15 rounds per day. Vehicle shortages transform 1st Parachute Army into a largely immobile force incapable of rapid maneuver. Student reviews vehicle allocation reports showing divisions authorize 1,600 trucks, receiving 120. This 92% shortfall means Fallschirmjäger divisions cannot reposition quickly, cannot conduct mobile defense, cannot exploit tactical opportunities requiring rapid movement. They can hold positions and conduct local counterattacks using interior lines, but operational mobility has disappeared. The absence of vehicles compounds other deficiencies. Ammunition arrives slowly because limited trucks make multiple trips. Casualties evacuate on foot or remain in aid stations. Hot food rarely reaches forward positions. These seem like administrative inconveniences until their cumulative effect is considered. Soldiers fighting without adequate ammunition, wounded dying for lack of timely evacuation, troops weakening from poor nutrition. Tactical effectiveness degrades not through combat, but through systemic failure to provide basic logistical support. The parachute production situation reaches absurdity in September 1944 when manufacture ceases entirely. Germany's sole parachute factory at Braunschweig closes because aluminum needed for parachute hardware has been reallocated to aircraft production. This means no new parachutes can be issued. Existing parachutes cannot be replaced when they wear out, and jump training must rely on aging equipment that increasingly fails safety standards. The immediate practical effect is minimal. 1st Parachute Army is not conducting airborne operations and won't conduct them in future. But the symbolic impact resonates throughout the force. Fallschirmjäger identity centers on parachute qualification. And now, the means to qualify new soldiers no longer exists. Jump training continues through November, using remaining parachute stocks, then ceases entirely, except for officers and senior NCOs whose qualification maintains institutional continuity. By December, 1st Parachute Army is an airborne force that no longer trains paratroopers, an elite formation defined by a capability it cannot exercise and replacements cannot acquire. The FG-42 rifle debacle exemplifies the gap between institutional aspiration and industrial reality. This weapon, selective fire, 20-round magazine, bipod for sustained fire, designed specifically for Fallschirmjäger, represents the most advanced infantry rifle of World War II. German ordnance experts project monthly production of 10,000 units to equip every paratrooper with this superior weapon. Actual production never exceeds 800 units monthly. Total war production reaches approximately 7,000 rifles, and most Fallschirmjäger never receive one. The factory-producing FG-42s require specialized machine tools, skilled labor, and materials all in desperately short supply. Meanwhile, the simpler Kar-98 KO bolt-action rifle can be produced at rates exceeding 100,000 monthly, using existing infrastructure. The result is foreordained. Most Fallschirmjäger carry Kar-98s. Some receive captured Soviet PPSH submachine guns. A lucky few obtain FG-42s. The variation in small arms creates logistical complexity and tactical problems. Units cannot conduct coordinated fire because individual soldiers' weapons have drastically different capabilities. November 1944 brings the replacement crisis to students' personal attention when 9th Fallschirmjäger Division reports receiving 500 replacements whose average age is 17.2 years. Student visits the division to assess these troops and discovers boys who completed 4 weeks of training, including no jump qualification. Parachute training had ceased before their intake. They have fired perhaps 30 rounds from their issued rifles. 75% have never thrown a live grenade. 40% cannot properly disassemble and clean their weapons. When student questions their unit commander about training deficiencies, the officer responds with defeated honesty. What am I to do? These are the replacements we receive. I either employ them or leave positions unmanned. Student observes these teenagers conducting close order drill, their movements sharp and precise, their equipment clean and properly maintained. They look like soldiers. Whether they can fight like soldiers will be determined in coming battles at costs. Student doesn't want to calculate. The most damning data emerges from battalion-level assessments conducted in December 1944. Student orders every battalion commander to report their unit's combat readiness using standardized metrics. The compiled results reveal catastrophic degradation. Of 73 Fallschirmjäger battalions in 1st Parachute Army, only 8 assess themselves as fully capable of offensive operations. These 8 comprise mostly Crete and casino veterans. 32 battalions assess as capable of defensive operations with support. These are mixed veteran and replacement units that can hold positions if provided adequate artillery and leadership. 23 battalions assess as capable of static defense only. Formations so deficient in training, equipment, and leadership that they cannot maneuver or conduct counterattacks. 10 battalions assess as questionable combat value. Units that might hold under favorable circumstances, but will likely collapse under sustained pressure. The disturbing statistic is the last category's existence. Student commands battalions whose own commanders doubt their ability to fight effectively. What distinguishes Fallschirmjäger from regular Wehrmacht infantry by late 1944 is primarily institutional culture and scattered pockets of excellence rather than systematic superiority. The typical Fallschirmjäger division contains several veteran companies that justify elite designation through skill, training, and combat experience. These companies operate at combat effectiveness equal to 1940 standards, disciplined, tactically proficient, led by experienced officers and NCOs. Surrounding them are companies of mixed quality ranging from adequate to marginal, soldiers who wear the same uniforms and carry the same weapons but possess fraction of the capability. The veteran companies provide backbone that stiffens entire divisions. When attacks hit, veterans demonstrate proper responses that replacements emulate. When defensive positions threaten to collapse, veteran-led counterattacks restore lines. The system works until casualties attrite veteran strength below critical thresholds. Then formations collapse not gradually, but catastrophically. The backbone breaks and everything it supported falls apart. December 1944. Fisher's training class completes final qualification exercise, a company-level defense against simulated attack. The recruits perform adequately in terms of individual skills. They take cover properly, fire their weapons competently, follow orders. But tactical coordination is absent. Machine gun teams position incorrectly. Rifle squads fail to provide mutual support. The defensive line contains gaps that enemy forces would exploit. Fisher passes the company anyway because standards have become suggestions rather than requirements. These recruits deploy next week to replace Ardennes casualties. Fisher knows statistically that 40% will be killed or wounded within their first month of combat. The survivors will become veterans who train the next replacement wave. This is how elite forces die, not suddenly in climactic defeat, but gradually through dilution. Each generation of replacements slightly less capable than predecessors, excellence slowly averaging toward adequacy, inadequacy slowly becoming acceptable. Fisher writes in his diary that night, "We call them Fallschirmjäger, and perhaps that designation motivates them to fight harder than they otherwise would. But they are not the men who took Eben Emael or held Casino. They wear the same uniforms, but are fighting a different war. The hollow core of 1st Parachute Army is complete. a structure that looks formidable from outside but collapses when pressure tests its strength. December the 16th, 1944, 0530 hours. Losheim Gap, Belgian-German border. Gefreiter Hans Meyer huddles in a snow-covered foxhole, weapon frozen to his hands, listening to the preparatory artillery barrage that signals Germany's final offensive in the west. Around him, 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division prepares to assault American positions in this forested sector. 13,000 soldiers designated elite, despite most having entered service within the last 6 months. Meyer himself completed training 9 weeks ago, participated in zero combat operations, and now crouches in darkness waiting to attack forces he's been told are demoralized and unprepared. The artillery lifts at precisely 0530 and whistles sound along the German line. Meyer climbs from his foxhole and advances into the forest with his platoon. Part of the massive assault wave that Hitler has gambled will split Allied armies and recapture Antwerp. Within 3 hours, Meyer will understand that everything he's been told about American weakness is catastrophically wrong, and his division will begin paying the price for Hitler's final delusion. The Ardennes offensive, Wehrmacht designation, Watch on the Rhine, commits 3 Fallschirmjäger divisions from 1st Parachute Army's northern wing, 3rd, 5th, and 9th divisions, totaling approximately 40,000 troops. Student's role in planning is minimal. He receives orders to provide forces for the offensive's northern shoulder, where Fallschirmjäger will punch through American lines around Monschau and Elsenborn Ridge, then wheel north to protect the main offensive's flank from Allied counterattacks. The plan's authors assume that elite Fallschirmjäger will achieve rapid breakthrough against surprised American forces, creating conditions for armored exploitation. This assumption ignores multiple realities. First, most Fallschirmjäger are no longer elite except in designation. Second, American forces in the Ardennes include veteran divisions that won't collapse under initial assault. Third, weather conditions favor defenders. Snow and ice limit mobility. Low clouds ground German air support. Poor visibility reduces German advantages in crew-served weapons. Student raises these concerns during planning conferences and is ignored. The offensive will proceed as designed because strategic desperation demands it. The initial assault achieves local success through surprise and numerical superiority. 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division attacks U.S. 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, holding the Losheim Gap, achieving a 5-to-1 advantage at points of contact. The Americans, spread thin across the sector, give ground under pressure as Doctrine demands, delaying rather than defending to the death, calling artillery on German assembly areas, withdrawing to prepared secondary positions. By midday on December 16th, 3rd Division has advanced 3 kilometers and captured several villages. To commanders receiving reports, this looks like textbook breakthrough. To soldiers experiencing combat, reality is harsher. Meyer's company started the morning with 112 effectives and by noon counts 74, 38 casualties in 6 hours, 34% casualty rate in the offensive's first day. American artillery proves devastatingly effective. Pre-registered defensive fire catches German forces in open ground repeatedly. And American ammunition expenditure seems unlimited compared to German experience where artillery support arrives in carefully rationed increments. The 3rd day reveals the operation's fundamental problem. Breakthrough cannot be sustained without momentum, and momentum requires resources. 1st Parachute Army doesn't possess. 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division reaches Elsenborn Ridge on December 18th and confronts American positions established on commanding terrain with clear fields of fire across approaches. German doctrine calls for combined arms assault, infantry to fix defenders, armor to achieve penetration, artillery to suppress defensive fires. 3rd Division can provide infantry but lacks armor support. Tanks allocated to the offensive concentrate with SS Panzer divisions further south, and artillery ammunition is strictly rationed. The resulting attacks are predictable failures. German infantry assault across open snow-covered slopes under American machine gun and artillery fire suffer appalling casualties, gain no ground, Lieutenant Werner Koch leads his platoon in 4 separate assaults over 2 days. Each attack follows the same pattern: advance under fire until casualties force withdrawal, reorganize depleted unit, attack again. By December 20th, Koch's platoon numbers 11 men from an original 38. They have gained 0 meters. Elsenborn Ridge remains in American hands. 5th Fallschirmjäger Division experiences similar frustration, attempting to encircle Bastogne from the northeast. The division, composed largely of Luftwaffe Field Division survivors with minimal infantry training, attacks American positions around the town with determination that substitutes for competence. They advance aggressively, suffer heavy casualties from American defensive fire, reorganize, attack again. The pattern repeats for a week without achieving operational objectives. American forces, though surrounded, maintain defensive coherence and receive aerial resupply once weather clears. 5th Division Commander requests armor support, artillery reinforcement, air cover. All requests are denied or delayed because resources concentrate with main offensive further south. By Christmas Eve, 5th Division has suffered 48% casualties, 6,200 killed, wounded, or missing from an initial strength of 13,000. They control several kilometers of territory around Bastogne's perimeter, which proves operationally meaningless when the town itself remains in American hands. 9th Fallschirmjäger Division, students' weakest formation, receives the mission of protecting 3rd Division's northern flank against American counterattacks. This defensive assignment plays to the division's limited capabilities. Holding prepared positions against enemy assaults requires less training and initiative than offensive operations. For 10 days, 9th Division performs adequately, repelling several American probing attacks and maintaining cohesion. Then, on December 26th, American First Army launches a major counteroffensive designed to reduce the bulge from north and south. 9th Division faces the full weight of American First Army's assault. Armor, artillery, air support, all the material advantages that Germany cannot match. The division's defenses collapse not gradually, but catastrophically. Entire companies surrender when surrounded and out of ammunition. Battalion command posts lose communication with subordinate units and cannot coordinate defense. By December 30th, 9th Division has ceased to exist as a coherent formation. Surviving elements retreat in disorder, leaving behind over 7,000 casualties and prisoners representing 62% of the division's starting strength. The human reality behind these statistics manifests in individual stories repeated across all 3 divisions. Meyer, survivor of 3rd Division's Elsenborn assaults, retreats through snow on January 3rd with his platoon reduced to 6 effectives. They haven't received hot food in 4 days. Ammunition is critically low, their weapons jam from ice accumulation. American artillery pursues them, shells bursting in tree canopies and showering lethal splinters across the forest floor. Meyer watches his squad leader take shrapnel through the chest and die within minutes. There are no medics, casualty evacuation has broken down completely. They leave the body where it falls and continue retreating. That night, Meyer's diary entry reads simply, "We were told we are elite. Elite soldiers do not retreat like this. Elite soldiers do not abandon their dead. We are not elite. We are boys playing at war, and the Americans are teaching us what war actually means." The Ardennes offensive fails comprehensively by mid-January 1945. German forces retreat to their starting positions, having gained nothing and lost irreplaceable manpower and equipment. 1st Parachute Army's contribution to this failure totals approximately 22,000 casualties from the 3 committed divisions, 9,200 killed, 11,800 wounded, 1,000 captured. The casualty rate, 55% of committed forces, exceeds even Crete's devastating losses. More critically, these casualties disproportionately include the veterans who provided backbone to mixed-quality formations. 3rd Division's veteran companies suffered 70 to 80% casualties in the Elsenborn Ridge attacks. 5th Division lost most of its experienced NCOs in the Bastogne perimeter fighting. 9th Division's collapse cost nearly all its veteran leadership, officers and sergeants either killed, captured, or missing. The formations that retreat from the Ardennes bear Fallschirmjäger designation, but are effectively militia, demoralized, under strength, led by junior officers promoted to replace casualties, manned by replacements with minimal training. Allied intelligence assessments of the Ardennes fighting reach interesting conclusions about 1st Parachute Army's actual capabilities. American interrogators question captured Fallschirmjäger from all 3 divisions, compiling reports that note contradictions between reputation and reality. One report states, Fallschirmjäger fought with determination, but displayed tactical rigidity, suggesting inadequate training. Small unit initiative was absent. When initial attacks failed, units repeated identical assaults rather than attempting flanking maneuvers or combined arms approaches. Officer casualties caused immediate degradation of unit effectiveness, indicating dependence on leadership rather than individual soldier quality. Equipment was adequate, but not superior to U.S. Army standard issue. Overall assessment: Fallschirmjäger designation appears to motivate soldiers to fight harder than regular Wehrmacht infantry, but actual combat effectiveness does not justify elite classification. The assessment is clinically accurate and devastatingly dismissive. 1st Parachute Army's aura of elite status, earned by men who jumped into Crete and held casino, has been tested against competent opposition in unfavorable circumstances and found hollow. February 1945. Student receives casualty reports and replacement allocations for his 3 shattered divisions. Total replacements available: 4,800 troops. Required to restore divisions to minimal combat effectiveness: 18,000. The mathematics are impossible. Student must reconstitute 3 divisions using resources sufficient for perhaps 1. He makes the brutal decision to disband 9th Division entirely, distributing its survivors between 3rd and 5th Divisions. This brings those formations to approximately 60% strength, enough to hold defensive positions, but inadequate for offensive operations. The Ardennes has accomplished Hitler's objective of delaying Allied advance, but at costs Germany cannot sustain. 1st Parachute Army has traded 22,000 casualties for 6 weeks' delay, a bargain that might seem worthwhile if Germany had anything to trade for time. But Germany's strategic situation admits no reprieve. Production cannot replace losses. Training cannot generate new elite soldiers. Will to fight cannot substitute for ammunition and fuel. Student understands this even if he cannot articulate it in official reports. 1st Parachute Army is dying. Expended in offensive operations, it was never equipped or trained to execute, sacrificed to operational plans, disconnected from resource reality. The winter ghosts of the Ardennes will haunt Germany's final months, not as symbols of elite capability, but as epitaph for forces consumed by strategic desperation. February 8, 1945, 0500 hours. Reichswald Forest, Germany. Oberst Kurt von der Heide stands in the observation bunker of 6th Fallschirmjäger Division headquarters, watching artillery flashes light the pre-dawn darkness like summer lightning. The barrage has continued for 3 hours. Over 1,000 Allied guns pounding German positions across a 20-kilometer front with scientific precision. Von der Heide, one of students' few remaining veteran commanders, calculates ammunition expenditure automatically from the flash patterns and concussion intervals. The Allies are firing at rates exceeding 500 rounds per minute across the entire front. In 10 minutes, they expend more artillery ammunition than his entire division possesses in total stocks. The mathematical disparity is so overwhelming that tactical skill becomes nearly irrelevant. When the barrage lifts at 0800 hours, Canadian 1st Army will attack with 15 divisions against von der Heide's 8,000 Fallschirmjäger. The mission is simple and impossible: hold the Reichswald Forest and prevent Allied breakthrough to the Rhine. Von der Heide knows his division will be destroyed. The only question is how long they can delay the inevitable. Students' 1st Parachute Army holds 200 kilometers of front from Nijmegen to Cologne, with approximately 60,000 effectives across 8 understrength divisions. The force density is suicidal: 1 soldier per 3.3 meters of front, compared to doctrinal requirement of 1 soldier per meter for effective defense. Student lacks reserves to plug breakthroughs, armor to conduct mobile defense, artillery to provide adequate fire support. What he possesses is terrain, The Reichswald forests dense woods and flooded ground channels attackers into predictable routes where German defensive positions maximize limited firepower. He also commands soldiers who, despite training deficiencies and equipment shortages, still identify as elite and fight accordingly. Students' defensive plan reflects harsh reality: trade space for time, conduct fighting withdrawals rather than static defense, preserve force rather than hold ground to the last man. The plan implicitly concedes defeat. The Rhine will be lost, but attempts to make that defeat as costly as possible for Allied forces. Operation Veritable, the Canadian offensive through the Reichswald, begins with overwhelming material superiority that makes German defensive positions temporary obstacles rather than barriers. The preliminary bombardment destroys most forward German positions. Bunkers collapse under direct hits. Communication trenches cave in. Minefields are detonated by explosive overpressure. When Canadian infantry advance at 0800 hours, they encounter dazed survivors rather than organized resistance. Von der Heide's forward battalions are overrun within 2 hours, survivors falling back to secondary positions deeper in the forest. But the Reichswald's terrain imposes friction on Allied advance. Narrow forest roads become bottlenecks when vehicles bunch up. Mud from recent rains bogs down armor. Visibility in dense woods reduces to meters. German defenders use terrain masterfully. Machine gun teams positioned to cover road junctions. Panzerfaust teams ambush tanks at close range where forest visibility negates Allied armor advantages. Snipers pick off Canadian officers from concealed positions in trees. The battle settles into vicious close-quarters combat where training and experience matter more than material superiority. Gefreiter Paul Richter, machine gunner with 6th Fallschirmjägers 2nd Regiment, positions his MG-42 to cover a forest trail that Canadian infantry must use to advance. His field of fire extends barely 80 meters before tree trunks block visibility. When Canadians appear, Richter opens fire at point-blank range. Sustained bursts that cut down the first squad before survivors can take cover. Canadian return fire riddled the trees around Richter's position, bark and wood splinters filling the air. Richter's assistant gunner feeds ammunition belts while Richter fires controlled bursts, conserving ammunition that cannot be replaced. After 30 minutes of exchange, Richter has fired 800 rounds and stopped one company's advance. Then Canadian artillery targets his position with precision that suggests forward observer direction. Richter and his assistant abandon the gun and retreat to fallback positions. The MG-42, Germany's finest infantry weapon, is left behind because carrying it while under artillery fire is suicide. This pattern repeats across the Reichswald. German defenders inflict disproportionate casualties, delay Allied advance, then withdraw before being overrun, abandoning equipment they cannot carry. The flooded Reichswald presents unique challenges that favor defenders despite Allied material advantages. Students' engineers deliberately breached dikes and flooded low-lying areas, creating impassable water barriers that channel Allied forces onto narrow causeways. German defenders position artillery and mortars to interdict these causeways, creating killing zones where Canadian forces bunch up in traffic jams. On February 10th, an entire Canadian brigade becomes bottlenecked on a single causeway under German artillery fire. Vehicles cannot turn around on the narrow road. Advancing units cannot deploy off-road into flooded terrain. Retreat is blocked by following units. German artillery pounds the trapped formation for 6 hours, destroying over 40 vehicles and inflicting 500 casualties before Canadians break through. The tactical success costs Germany perhaps 50 artillery rounds. Acceptable exchange given ammunition shortages. But tactical success does not translate to strategic advantage. Canadians absorb the casualties, bring up replacements, continue advancing. Germany cannot replace the artillery rounds expended. Student rotates divisions through the Reichswald fighting, pulling shattered formations out of line and replacing them with less damaged units. This preserves some combat capability, but ensures no unit can establish strong defensive positions. 7th Fallschirmjäger Division relieves 6th Division on February 14th after 6 days of continuous combat. 7th Division arrives at approximately 70% strength, 9,800 effectives, and establishes positions in sectors 6th Division has already partially lost. Within 3 days, 7th Division suffers 2,200 casualties, reducing combat strength to 65%. The casualty rate, 22% in 72 hours, is unsustainable but typical of Reichswald fighting. German defensive doctrine emphasizes preserving force. But preservation becomes impossible when Allied forces attack continuously with overwhelming firepower. Units must either abandon positions and preserve strength, or defend positions and suffer decimation. Student increasingly chooses preservation, trading kilometers for casualties at ratios that might seem favorable: 300 German casualties to inflict 1,500 Allied losses, except Germany has no strategic depth remaining to trade. The American Ninth Army's Operation Grenade, launched February 23rd from the south, dooms any hope of sustained Rhineland defense. Student now faces Allied offensives from 2 directions: Canadian First Army pushing from the northwest through the Reichswald, American Ninth Army driving from the south toward Dusseldorf. His 60,000 Fallschirmjäger must defend against over 300,000 Allied troops with complete air superiority and ammunition. Expenditure rates 10 times German capability. Student requests permission to withdraw across the Rhine immediately, preserving forces for defense of Germany proper. The request is denied. Hitler demands Rhineland be held. Every meter traded for maximum casualties inflicted. Student implements the order, knowing it sentences his army to destruction, conducting a fighting withdrawal that satisfies letter of orders while ignoring their spirit. 1st Parachute Army retreats toward the Rhine in stages, holding positions for hours rather than days, withdrawing before encirclement rather than fighting to annihilation. The defense of Wesel, the last significant Rhineland city before the Rhine, exemplifies 1st Parachute Army's terminal condition. 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, students' most veteran formation, deployed from Italy specifically to hold Wesel and its critical Rhine bridges. The division arrives at 20% strength, 2,800 effectives from authorized 14,000, and attempts to defend a city whose civilian population has been evacuated and industrial infrastructure already destroyed by Allied bombing. On March 22nd, Allied forces surround Wesel on 3 sides, leaving only the Rhine bridges as escape route. Student orders 1st Division to hold for 24 hours, then withdraw across the Rhine during darkness. The division holds for 18 hours against overwhelming assault, then executes nighttime withdrawal under Allied artillery fire. The retreat across Wesel's bridges becomes chaos, engineers attempting to prepare demolitions while infantry streams across, Allied artillery targeting the bridges with accuracy suggesting excellent intelligence, vehicles and equipment abandoned to accelerate withdrawal. 1st Division reaches the Rhine's eastern bank with 1,700 effectives, 40% casualties in 1 day's fighting. March 24th brings Operation Varsity, the Allied airborne assault across the Rhine near Wesel, and student experiences the ultimate irony of watching his life's work employed against him. 16,000 British and American paratroopers descend in a single massive drop, landing directly on the Rhine's eastern bank, where German defenses are weakest. 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, now reduced to little more than a reinforced regiment, engages Allied paratroopers in fighting that mirrors Crete, but with roles and outcomes reversed. German machine gunners fire into descending parachutes, inflicting casualties on vulnerable airborne troops during descent. But Allied numerical superiority and immediate link-up with ground forces crossing the Rhine overwhelm German defenders within hours. Student watches from his headquarters as 1st Division. The formation that took Eben Emael, survived Crete, held Cassino, disintegrates under the weight of an airborne operation, executed with resources Germany never possessed. March 28th marks 1st Parachute Army's formal dissolution. Student receives orders relieving him of command and assigning his surviving forces to Army Group H under General Johannes Blaskowitz. The administrative change reflects military reality. 1st Parachute Army no longer exists as coherent operational formation. Students' 8 divisions have been reduced to remnants totaling approximately 35,000 effectives scattered across northwest Germany. They retain Fallschirmjäger designation and unit identifications, but organizational coherence has dissolved. Students' Final Commanders Conference assembles 23 officers representing formations that began the war as division or regiment commands. They meet in a basement in Münster, surrounded by rubble from Allied bombing, discussing dispositions for forces that barely merit battalion designation. Students' remarks are brief and factual. Acknowledge the soldiers' sacrifices. Note that resistance continues. Avoid the obvious conclusion that the war is lost. When student finishes, no one speaks. What remains to say? 1st Parachute Army entered combat in September 1944 with 85,000 troops. 6 months later, 60% are casualties. The survivors are defeated not through lack of courage or tactical incompetence, but through mathematical inevitability. The Rhineland campaign's statistical summary reveals defensive effectiveness that proves strategically meaningless. 1st Parachute Army inflicted approximately 51,000 Allied casualties, while suffering 39,000 German losses. A 1.3 to 1 exchange ratio favoring the Allies despite Germany fighting from defensive positions. The disparity reflects Allied material advantages overwhelming German tactical skill. More tellingly, the campaign demonstrated that elite status provides minimal advantage in industrial warfare's final phase. Fallschirmjäger divisions fought more tenaciously than regular Wehrmacht formations, but achieved no better tactical results. When Allied forces attacked with 10 to 1 artillery advantages, complete air superiority, and unlimited ammunition, German defensive skill became irrelevant. Positions held for hours rather than days. Casualties inflicted satisfied honor, but didn't delay Allied advance meaningfully. The Rhineland taught the final lesson that Crete began teaching in 1941. Specialized training and elite designation cannot overcome overwhelming material disparity. Germany's paratroopers had become expert defensive infantry, but expertise without resources is simply elegant futility. April 1945. Student sits in his commandeered office in Schleswig-Holstein, reviewing personnel reports from dissolved 1st Parachute Army units now scattered across northern Germany. The reports catalog destruction with bureaucratic precision. 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, 800 effectives. 2nd Division, 1,200 effectives. 6th Division, disbanded. Survivors distributed to other formations. 7th Division, 900 effectives. The litany continues. Divisions reduced to battalion strength, regiments to companies, companies to platoons. Student calculates that 1st Parachute Army, which theoretically comprised 170,000 troops at maximum strength, now musters perhaps 15,000 combat-ready soldiers across all formations. The Rhineland consumed 50,000 casualties. The difference between authorized strength and current strength, 105,000 troops, represents soldiers who never existed except on organizational charts, the paper army fully revealed. Student's life's work has ended not in climactic battle but in administrative dissolution. His elite airborne forces reduced to scattered conventional infantry awaiting final defeat. He drafts no after-action report. What analysis could justify the futility? The fortress Rhineland was indefensible from the beginning, held by insufficient forces against impossible odds, sacrificed to satisfy strategic fantasies disconnected from operational reality. Student's army is gone, destroyed defending a border that could not be held to preserve a regime that deserved no preservation. March 24th, 1945, 1000 hours. Eastern bank of the Rhine River near Wesel. Private James Mitchell, 17th Airborne Division, descends through smoke and anti-aircraft fire toward German-occupied farmland below. Around him, the sky fills with parachutes, 16,000 Allied paratroopers executing the largest single-day airborne drop in history. Mitchell's C-47 transport has taken flak damage, the aircraft shuddering from hits, but his stick exits on schedule at 400 feet. His parachute deploys cleanly, and Mitchell has perhaps 15 seconds to observe the battlefield before landing. What he sees astonishes him. The scale is overwhelming. 1,700 transport aircraft and 1,300 gliders fill the air. their formations stretching to every horizon. Allied fighter aircraft orbit overhead, suppressing German anti-aircraft batteries. Artillery fire from the Rhine's western bank pounds German positions in coordinated preparation. This is not the desperate improvisation of Market Garden or the isolated vulnerability of Crete. This is airborne warfare executed with industrial resources that make tactical skill almost secondary to material supremacy. Operation Varsity's planning reflects every lesson Allied commanders learned from previous airborne disasters. Market Garden failed because paratroopers landed too far from objectives, allowing German forces time to respond. Varsity's drop zones are immediately adjacent to tactical objectives. Mitchell lands 800 meters from his company's assigned bridge. Arnhem failed because link-up with ground forces took 9 days and never fully succeeded. Varsity coordinates airborne assault with simultaneous ground crossing. British Second Army is already crossing the Rhine in assault boats as Mitchell descends. Crete failed because sequential drops allowed defenders to concentrate against each wave. Varsity commits all forces simultaneously in a single massive drop, executed in 2 hours. The operational design eliminates every vulnerability that destroyed previous airborne operations through overwhelming force and meticulous coordination. Mitchell lands in a plowed field, cuts himself free from his parachute harness, and immediately comes under machine gun fire from a German position 200 meters distant. But around him, thousands of paratroopers are landing simultaneously. The German machine gunners cannot target everyone. The German forces defending against Varsity are remnants of Student's 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, approximately 2,800 troops spread across sectors that should be defended by 14,000. They fight with tactical competence learned through years of combat, but numbers and resources make resistance futile from the beginning. Obergefreiter Hans Weber, machine gunner defending a crossroads near Hammenkeln, watches Allied paratroopers descend and experiences déjà vu from Crete 4 years earlier. But the circumstances are inverted. At Crete, German paratroopers landed scattered and vulnerable. Defenders concentrated fire. Isolated landing zones became killing grounds. Here, Allied paratroopers land in such density that concentrating fire on one group means ignoring 10 others. Weber's MG-42 kills perhaps 12 paratroopers during their descent. Then Allied infantry suppress his position from 3 directions simultaneously. Weber attempts to reposition but comes under mortar fire. Allied paratroopers have landed with their own mortars and are providing immediate fire support. Within 30 minutes of the drop beginning, Weber's position is surrounded. He surrenders at 10:45 hours, having delayed Allied advance by 45 minutes. The equipment disparity between Varsity and German airborne operations is so stark it approaches different warfare paradigms. Mitchell's company lands with crew-served weapons, ammunition loads far exceeding German paratrooper standards, and immediate radio communication with ground forces. His battalion receives artillery support from guns positioned across the Rhine within 10 minutes of landing. Forward observers coordinate fire missions, while paratroopers are still assembling. Gliders landing in fields deliver jeeps, anti-tank guns, and supplies in quantities German paratroopers never approached. Mitchell watches a Waco glider land 200 meters away. And within 5 minutes, a jeep towing a 75mm pack howitzer drives out and begins engaging German positions. The contrast with German airborne doctrine is absolute. German paratroopers landed armed only with pistols. Their heavy weapons dropped separately in containers, frequently lost or destroyed. Allied paratroopers land as combined arms teams with organic fire support immediately available. The British 6th Airborne Division's assault on Hammenkeln demonstrates what airborne operations become when resources aren't constrained. The division drops 7,800 paratroopers directly onto the town in a concentrated assault that overwhelms German defenders through sheer mass. Buildings occupied by German machine gun teams receive simultaneous assault from multiple directions. German strongpoints are bypassed by airborne forces who simply flow around resistance, isolating defenders without reducing each position sequentially. By 11:30 hours, Hammenkeln is secured, and British paratroopers are consolidating defensive positions against potential German counterattacks. The operation from drop to objective seizure required 90 minutes, approximately the time it took German paratroopers at Eben Emael to begin their assault after landing. The difference is resource allocation. British 6th Airborne operates with support infrastructure that makes tactical problems solvable through application of firepower rather than requiring tactical elegance. German artillery attempts to interdict Allied landing zones, but discovers that Allied air superiority makes artillery employment suicidal. Hauptmann Ernst Fischer, commanding a battery of 4 10.5-centimeter howitzers, positions his guns to engage British drop zones and fires 6 rounds per gun before Allied fighter bombers locate his position. The aircraft attack with rockets and cannon fire, destroying 3 guns and killing most of Fischer's crews within 4 minutes. Fischer's surviving gun displaces to alternate position and manages 8 more rounds before another air attack destroys it. Fischer's total contribution to the battle is 52 artillery rounds that killed perhaps a dozen Allied paratroopers before his entire battery was annihilated. The exchange ratio, 1 German artillery battery for 12 Allied casualties, reflects the impossibility of conventional defense against opponents with complete air superiority and unlimited ammunition. The link-up between airborne and ground forces occurs so rapidly, it validates the entire operational concept. British Second Army crosses the Rhine at multiple points, supported by massive artillery preparation and smoke screens. German defenders, already engaged with airborne forces in their rear areas, cannot organize coherent resistance against simultaneous frontal assault. By 1400 hours, British armor reaches airborne positions east of the Rhine, completing link-up less than 4 hours after the initial drop. This is the fundamental difference between Varsity and every previous airborne operation. Ground forces arrive before airborne forces become vulnerable through isolation. Mitchell's company holds its assigned bridge for 2 hours and 17 minutes before British tanks arrive. The vulnerability period that destroyed German paratroopers at Crete and British paratroopers at Arnhem simply doesn't exist. Allied planning has solved airborne warfare's fundamental challenge through overwhelming resource commitment. Captured German paratroopers, interrogated by Allied intelligence officers, provide perspective on the qualitative differences between German and Allied airborne doctrine. Feldwebel Klaus Hartmann, veteran of Crete and Cassino, surrenders at Hamminkeln after his platoon is surrounded and out of ammunition. When interrogators ask him to compare Varsity with German airborne operations, Hartmann's response is professionally candid. If we had possessed these resources at Crete, the island would have fallen in 48 hours with minimal casualties. Your advantage is not better soldiers or superior doctrine. German paratroopers were as well trained as yours. Your advantage is that you can afford to solve problems through material application rather than requiring tactical perfection. You land with jeeps and artillery. We landed with pistols and hope. You have unlimited ammunition and air support. We ration rifle rounds. This isn't warfare. It's industrial production applied to military operations. The casualty statistics validate airborne warfare as viable when resource constraints don't apply. Allied forces in Varsity suffer 2,400 casualties from 16,000 committed troops, a 15% casualty rate. German defenders lose approximately 3,800 killed, wounded, and captured from initial strength of 4,200, a 90% casualty rate. The disparity reflects defender vulnerability when attackers possess overwhelming advantages in numbers, firepower, and air support. More significantly, Allied casualties are disproportionately wounded rather than killed. Medical evacuation by helicopter and rapid casualty clearing procedures ensure that wounded paratroopers receive treatment within hours. German wounded at Crete often waited days for evacuation or received no treatment at all. The industrial logistical support infrastructure surrounding Varsity transforms it from high-risk tactical gamble into methodical operation, where acceptable losses are accepted as a cost of doing business. Student observing Varsity from his headquarters in Schleswig-Holstein through intelligence reports and captured message traffic experiences complex emotions. Professional pride wars with bitter recognition of what might have been. Varsity proves everything student believed about airborne warfare's potential. that vertical envelopment can achieve decisive tactical results when properly resourced and integrated with ground operations. But Varsity also demonstrates what student always knew: airborne operations require resource commitment that only nations with overwhelming industrial capacity can sustain. Germany attempted airborne warfare on a shoestring, improvising doctrine and equipment because alternatives didn't exist. The results were disaster at Crete and abandonment of airborne operations entirely. The Allies waited, observed German mistakes, built overwhelming capability, then executed airborne operations with resources that made tactical problems trivial. Student drafts a memo analyzing Varsity, noting that the operation validated his pre-war vision while demonstrating why Germany could never realize that vision. The memo is filed and forgotten. By late March 1945, theoretical discussions of airborne doctrine have become academic exercises in analyzing a war already lost. The broader implications of Varsity extend beyond the immediate tactical success. The operation proves that airborne warfare remains viable in modern combat when three conditions are met. First, attackers possess overwhelming air superiority that suppresses defensive fires and prevents enemy reinforcement. Second, airborne forces receive immediate link-up with ground forces, preventing isolation. Third, industrial capacity provides equipment and ammunition at scales that eliminate resource constraints. These conditions existed for the Allies in March 1945 and existed for no nation in any previous airborne operation. Varsity is simultaneously vindication of airborne doctrine and demonstration that such operations are practical only for wealthy nations, fighting from positions of industrial dominance. The lesson is unlearned by post-war airborne forces who study Varsity's techniques while ignoring its resource prerequisites. Future airborne operations, Suez, Vietnam, Grenada, will repeatedly discover that tactical elegance cannot substitute for material superiority, a lesson German paratroopers learned at Crete and their spiritual descendants will relearn across decades. April 15, 1945, somewhere in northern Germany. Gefreiter Paul Richter marches west in a column of perhaps 200 Fallschirmjäger, the remnants of 2nd Fallschirmjäger Regiment retreating from positions they no longer have orders to hold. The column has no vehicles, no heavy weapons, no radio communication with higher command. They march because retreating seems preferable to remaining in positions where Allied forces will eventually surround them. Richter has not seen an officer above lieutenant rank in 4 days. His company commander was killed in an American artillery barrage on April 12th. The battalion commander disappeared that same night. Whether killed, captured, or simply departed is unknown. The regiment's organization has dissolved into informal groups of soldiers who know each other and stay together for mutual support. They are still Fallschirmjäger in some technical sense. They wear the distinctive smocks, carry the paratrooper helmets, retain unit designations. But they are an army in name only, a defeated formation awaiting the formality of surrender. 1st Parachute Army's dissolution proceeds through March and April, not as dramatic military defeat, but as organizational disintegration, spreading like decay. Units maintain cohesion while they have missions, then fragment when missions become impossible to execute or orders stop arriving. 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division retreats from the Voser River in mid-April, maintaining unit structure through the first week of withdrawal. By April 15th, the division comprises independent battle groups, a battalion here, 2 companies there, operating autonomously because division headquarters no longer controls communications. These battle groups continue fighting when attacked, but lack operational objective beyond survival. 7th Fallschirmjäger. Division simply vanishes from Wehrmacht order of battle in early April. The formation appears in situation reports on April 5th, then disappears with no record of formal dissolution or surrender. Individual soldiers from 7th Division eventually surrender to British forces at various locations across northern Germany, but the division as organizational entity ceases to exist without official recognition of its demise. Student himself becomes increasingly irrelevant to the military situation developing around him. Relieved of 1st Parachute Army Command on March 28th, he holds administrative position in Army Group H, but lacks authority to influence operational decisions. He spends his days processing reports that arrive irregularly and describes situations that have already changed by the time reports reach his headquarters. On April 18th, student receives a message from 2nd Fallschirmjäger Division requesting permission to withdraw from current positions and retreat behind the Elbe River. Student drafts authorization and attempts to transmit it through military communication channels that no longer reliably function. Whether the authorization reaches 2nd Division, whether the division withdraws regardless of receiving permission, whether the division still exists as coherent formation, student has no reliable information. The Prussian military tradition of clear command structure and precise orders has collapsed into chaos, where individual commanders make decisions based on local circumstances and hope they align with higher intent that may no longer exist. The final orders, student issues as operational commander, come on April 18th and reflect both personal honor and practical futility. He directs all remaining Fallschirmjäger formations to continue resistance, to hold positions where possible, to conduct fighting withdrawals where necessary. The orders acknowledge reality while maintaining pretense of military discipline. Student knows the war is lost, knows continued resistance achieves nothing beyond additional casualties, knows that honorable surrender would save lives. But Wehrmacht traditions and personal conviction demand that orders instruct resistance, that soldiers be told to fight, that the forms of military propriety be maintained even when substance has evaporated. The orders reach perhaps 40% of units they are intended for. Of those units receiving orders, perhaps 60% have any capability to execute them. The remainder are scattered remnants without heavy weapons, ammunition, or organizational structure. They continue resistance by virtue of not yet having surrendered, not through any meaningful combat effectiveness. The individual soldier's experience during 1st Parachute Army's final weeks varies dramatically based on unit location, command quality, and random chance. Richter's group marches west, avoids major combat, and surrenders to British forces on April 28th when their route is cut by Allied armor. The surrender is anticlimactic. A British tank commander accepts their weapons, directs them to a prisoner collection point, and the war ends for Richter with more relief than shame. Obergefreiter Josef Weber, fighting with 1st Fallschirmjäger, division remnants near Bremen, experiences very different conclusion. His battle group of approximately 150 men occupies defensive positions in Bremen's outskirts and fights against British assault for 3 days before being overrun on May 2nd. Weber is wounded by shell fragments during the final assault, evacuated to a field hospital by British medics, and survives the war as a casualty rather than prisoner. Gefreiter Hans Meyer, survivor of the Ardennes offensive, simply walks away from his unit on April 25th and makes his way home to Bavaria, discarding his uniform and adopting civilian clothes. He reaches his village on May 7th, one day before Germany's formal surrender, and the war ends for him in his mother's kitchen. The variety of endings reflects collapsed command structure, unable to impose uniform procedure on forces scattered across hundreds of kilometers. Some units surrender to Allied forces in formal ceremonies, where officers present swords and enlisted men stack weapons in organized rows. Other units dissolve informally, as soldiers simply abandon positions and depart. Some commanders negotiate local truces with Allied counterparts, arranging ceasefires that spare their men further combat. Other commanders fight to literal annihilation, holding positions until overrun and accepting death or capture as war's final outcome. 1st Parachute Army dies in all these ways simultaneously, some formations surrendering ceremonially, others evaporating without acknowledgement, still others destroyed in final combat that military historians will barely note. The organizational death matches the organizational life, a paper army that looked formidable on charts but never achieved the cohesion or capability its designation suggested. Student's personal war ends on May 3rd, when British forces capture him at his headquarters in Schleswig-Holstein. The capture is professionally courteous. British officers recognize Student's rank and reputation, accord him military honors, and process him as high-value prisoner rather than common POW. Student surrenders his sidearm to a British brigadier who personally admires Student's contributions to airborne warfare development and expresses professional respect while executing his duty. The moment contains surreal quality. The architect of German airborne forces formally surrendering to representatives of Allied airborne forces who learned from his innovations and surpassed them through superior resources. Student is transported to detention facilities in Britain, where he will await war crimes investigation, focusing on Crete atrocities and reprisals against civilians. The investigation will eventually clear Student of personal culpability. His command responsibilities during Crete focused on tactical operations rather than occupation policy, but the process requires 2 years. Student's war ends in capture. But his accountability for that war's conduct will be judged through peacetime legal processes. May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. Across northern Germany, scattered Fallschirmjäger units receive surrender orders through various channels. Radio broadcasts, Allied announcements, messages from German commands attempting to coordinate capitulation. The responses vary. Some units march to designated surrender points in formation, maintaining military discipline through their final act as combatants. Other units simply stop fighting and wait for Allied forces to process them. Individual soldiers make personal decisions about surrender. Some comply immediately, others attempt to evade capture and return home. A few continue sporadic resistance that achieves nothing except their own deaths. The approximately 60,000 soldiers identifying as Fallschirmjäger at war's end represent perhaps 35% of 1st Parachute Army's authorized strength. The remainder are casualties, deserters, or soldiers whose status cannot be determined because administrative records have been destroyed or lost. The final casualty statistics for German Fallschirmjäger forces reveal the complete cost of elite designation in a war Germany could not win. Approximately 120,000 Fallschirmjäger were killed in action between 1939 and 1945. This figure includes all parachute-qualified soldiers and those designated Fallschirmjäger in the war's later years, regardless of jump qualification. Wounded casualties likely approached 200,000, though precise figures are unavailable because many wounded were never formally evacuated or processed. POW numbers reached approximately 90,000, counting all Fallschirmjäger captured across all theaters. The total committed strength of Fallschirmjäger forces across the war is difficult to establish. Perhaps 350,000 soldiers served in parachute-designated units at some point, but casualty rates approach or exceed 100% when the ratio of casualties to peak formation and strength is calculated. These numbers demonstrate that Fallschirmjäger designation, whether earned through rigorous training or assigned administratively, correlated with increased casualty probability. Elite forces are committed where battles are critical, and critical battles generate catastrophic casualties. The surviving Fallschirmjäger disperse into prisoner of war camps across Allied-occupied Europe, where they will spend months or years awaiting repatriation. Their status as elite soldiers provides no advantages in captivity. A private from 1st Fallschirmjäger Division who jumped at Crete receives identical treatment as a conscript assigned to 9th Fallschirmjäger Division who never completed parachute training. The Fallschirmjäger identity, maintained through years of combat as psychological bulwark against defeat, becomes irrelevant in POW camps where all German soldiers are simply defeated enemies awaiting processing. The organizational structure that defined Fallschirmjäger existence, regiments, divisions, corps, ceases to exist except in memories. The traditions, the combat records, the sense of belonging to something exceptional, all survive only in individual recollections of men who wear generic POW uniforms, indistinguishable from anyone else. First, Parachute Army's dissolution is complete, not when its units surrender, but when its soldiers lose the institutional context that made them Fallschirmjäger, rather than simply German soldiers who happened to fight in airborne designated formations. Student, imprisoned in British detention pending war crimes investigation, receives fragmentary information about his former command's fate through Red Cross messages and intelligence summaries provided during interrogations. He learns of units' surrender, casualty estimates, the dispersion of survivors into various POW camps. The information arrives without emotional context, dry, factual reports that soldiers are accounted for or missing, that divisions no longer exist, that 1st Parachute Army has been removed from Allied order of battle. Student processes this information with professional detachment maintained through decades of military service. He does not allow himself to dwell on the human cost, the 120,000 dead, the families destroyed, the futures ended by decisions he participated in making. Such reflection would be unbearable and would serve no purpose. The war is over. The judgments will come from tribunals and historians. Students' remaining task is simply to survive his captivity and await whatever accountability the victors impose. The architect of Germany's airborne forces has outlived his creation. 1st Parachute Army is gone, existing only in records and memories, another military formation that fought courageously and lost comprehensively, because tactical excellence cannot overcome strategic impossibility.